He never commanded legions that subjugated foreign lands or expanded the borders of the known world. His battlefields were the courthouse, the public square, and the Senate floor. His weapons were not the sword and shield, but logic, ethics, and the devastating power of the Latin language, which he wielded with more skill and precision than any man before or since. His name was Marcus Tullius Cicero, and in the turbulent final decades of the 1st century BC, as the Roman Republic tore itself apart, he stood as its most defiant voice. This was an age of titans, a time when Rome was the undisputed master of the Mediterranean world. From the outside, it was a picture of absolute power and success. Its legions were invincible, its engineering marvels were unparalleled, and a constant river of wealth, slaves, and tribute flowed into the capital from 100 conquered provinces. But this glittering facade concealed a deep and deadly sickness. The Republic, a system of government built on shared power and the rule of law that had endured for nearly 500 years, was dying. Its traditional values, what the Romans called the mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors, were crumbling under the immense weight of empire. The very foundations of the state were cracking. For centuries, the backbone of the Roman army had been the citizen farmer, men who owned small plots of land and fought to defend their property and their state. But now, these small farms were being swallowed up by enormous estates, the latifundia, owned by the super-rich and worked by vast armies of slaves. Unable to compete, millions of Roman citizens were forced off their land. They flocked to the city of Rome, forming a volatile and desperate urban mob, unemployed and dependent on state handouts of grain. This created a profound crisis. What happens when a nation of farmers becomes a city of dependents? A new breed of leader saw an opportunity. Generals like Gaius Marius began to recruit these landless poor into the army, offering them a salary, equipment, and the one thing they truly desired, the promise of a plot of land upon retirement. In doing so, they created a new kind of Roman army. These soldiers were no longer loyal to the abstract idea of the Senate and the Roman people. They were loyal to the one man who guaranteed their livelihood, their general. This catastrophic shift in loyalty unleashed the forces that would destroy the Republic. The state lost its monopoly on violence. Ambitious generals now had private armies at their command. The first to demonstrate the terrifying potential of this new reality was Lucius Cornelius Sulla. After a brutal civil war, he marched his army on Rome itself, a sacrilege previously unthinkable, and declared himself dictator, unleashing a reign of terror known as the Proscriptions, where he posted lists of his enemies who could be killed for a reward. Sulla showed that the ultimate argument in Roman politics was no longer the finest speech, but the sharpest sword. He set the stage for the men who would follow. Pompey the Great, a military hero of immense fame, and the brilliant, charming, and utterly ruthless Julius Caesar. These were men who saw the state not as a thing to be served, but as a prize to be won. Into this violent, chaotic world, Marcus Tullius Cicero was born an outsider. He was not from Rome, but from the small town of Arpinum. He was not born into one of the great noble families who saw governing Rome as their birthright. He possessed no glorious military record, no ancestral fame to pave his way. He was a homo novus, a new man, a term the arrogant Roman elite used with a faint sneer. To them, he was an upstart. This status as an outsider defined him. It instilled in him a ferocious, burning ambition to prove he was better, smarter, and more Roman than any blue-blooded aristocrat. It also left him with a lifelong insecurity, a deep-seated need for validation that often manifested as a vanity that his enemies found insufferable and even his friends found tiring. His life would become a grand, tragic struggle against the inevitable tide of history. He was a man of profound contradictions, an intellectual who was forced to be a crisis manager, a man of peace who lived in a time of constant war. He possessed immense physical and moral courage, willing to risk his life to prosecute powerful criminals, yet he could also be plagued by crippling indecision at key moments. He believed passionately in the rule of law, in compromise, and in what he called the Concordia Ordinum, a harmony between the classes, in an age that was polarizing into violent extremes. His journey is a timeless epic of ambition, principle, betrayal, and sacrifice. It is the story of a man who saw the world he loved descend into madness, and who dared to speak truth to power, even when he knew it would cost him everything. Was he a naive idealist, whose principles were no match for the dawning age of emperors? Or was he the last true hero of the Roman Republic, its most passionate defender, whose tragic fall symbolized the death of freedom itself? His life poses a question that echoes through our own time. In the face of overwhelming force, what is the true worth of a single defiant voice? For centuries, the Roman Republic was held together by more than just its laws and legions. At its heart was an unwritten code of conduct, a set of sacred traditions known as the mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors. This was the moral bedrock of their society, an ethos that prized duty over personal desire, integrity over wealth, and unwavering service to the state above all else. A Roman was expected to be stoic, pious, and disciplined. This code defined what it meant to be Roman, and for generations, it had provided the social glue that allowed the Republic to endure crises and expand its power. But by the late 2nd century BC, this glue was dissolving. The endless wars of conquest had a paradoxical effect. They made Rome rich beyond imagination, but they also imported foreign customs, new luxuries, and a level of individual greed that was fundamentally alien to the old Roman character. Senators who had once lived modestly now governed vast provinces, returning with fortunes large enough to buy elections and live like kings. A culture of austerity was replaced by one of ostentatious consumption. Integrity, once the highest virtue, was now seen by many as a naive obstacle to acquiring wealth and power. The old families watched in horror as the values their ancestors had died for were eroded by the very success those values had built. The mos maiorum was no longer a living code. For many, it was becoming a hollow slogan, invoked in speeches but ignored in practice. The first open challenge to this decaying order came from two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. They were aristocrats of the highest pedigree, grandsons of the legendary general Scipio Africanus, the man who had defeated Hannibal. But they saw the profound injustice of the land crisis unfolding around them. They watched as the citizen farmer, the traditional backbone of Rome, was being driven into poverty and ruin. In 133 BC, Tiberius Gracchus was elected as a tribune of the plebs, an office designed to protect the common people. He proposed a radical yet simple law to reclaim public land that had been illegally occupied by the wealthy elite and redistribute it in small plots to the landless poor. This was not just an economic reform. It was a desperate attempt to restore the very fabric of Roman society, to turn the urban mob back into self-sufficient citizens and soldiers. The wealthy senators, whose fortunes were built on these vast illegal estates, were outraged. They saw Gracchus not as a reformer, but as a revolutionary demagogue threatening their property and their grip on power. When Tiberius sought an unprecedented second term as tribune to see his reforms through, they decided to break the most sacred rule of Roman politics. For centuries, physical violence within the sacred confines of the city had been an unthinkable taboo. Disagreements were settled with votes and speeches, not with weapons. But on election day, a mob of senators and their clients, led by the Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of Rome, took wooden clubs and bludgeoned Tiberius Gracchus and 300 of his followers to death on the Catiline hill. Their bodies were unceremoniously dumped into the river Tiber. A terrible line had been crossed. A decade later, Tiberius's younger brother, Gaius, took up the cause with even more ambition, proposing a wide range of reforms. His fate was the same. Cornered by his political enemies, he chose to commit suicide rather than be captured and killed by the senatorial mob that was hunting him and thousands of his supporters. The deaths of the Gracchi brothers were a point of no return for the Republic. The message was clear and brutal. Political opposition could now be met with organized murder. The unspoken rules that had governed Roman politics for centuries were shattered. The precedent was set that the powerful could use violence to eliminate any threat to their interests. From this moment on, the political arena in Rome would become increasingly deadly, a place where the stakes were no longer just victory or defeat in a debate, but life or death itself. This was the legacy of violence and division that would define the world of Cicero's youth. The political murders of the Gracchi brothers had opened a Pandora's box in Rome, and the violence they unleashed would soon escalate into full-scale civil war. The next generation of leaders learned the lesson of their deaths all too well. That power no longer grew from tradition and consensus, but from popularity with the masses and the loyalty of soldiers. The first to master this new, brutal formula was a man named Gaius Marius. Like Cicero, he was a homo novus, a new man, and remarkably, he also came from Cicero's small hometown of Arpinum. But where Cicero would later choose the law and the word as his path to power, Marius chose the sword. He was a brilliant, rugged, and immensely popular general who had reformed the Roman army, opening its ranks to the landless poor. In doing so, he saved Rome from barbarian invasions but also created a professional army that was loyal not to the Senate, but to him personally. He was the hero of the common man, a populist who held the consulship an unprecedented 7 times. Marius's rise to power terrified the old aristocracy. They saw him as a dangerous upstart who was destroying the traditional order. Their champion emerged in the form of Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Sulla was everything Marius was not, a descendant of an ancient but impoverished noble family, a man of refined tastes, but also of shocking cruelty and boundless ambition. He was a military genius in his own right, and he saw himself as the restorer of the Senate's authority, the man who would put the populist mob and their hero Marius back in their place. The rivalry between these two giants, festering for years, finally exploded over a prestigious and highly profitable military command. When the Senate gave it to Sulla, Marius's allies used the popular assemblies to override their decision. Sulla's response would shatter the Republic forever. He did the unthinkable. He took the 6 legions he had assembled for the foreign war and marched them on Rome. For the first time in its long history, a Roman general led a Roman army against the city of Rome itself. It was the ultimate act of treason, a sacrilege that horrified a generation. The legions created to protect the Republic were now being used as a personal tool to settle a political dispute. Sulla seized the city, declared Marius an enemy of the state, and then, satisfied, departed for his war in the east. But the moment he was gone, Marius returned. With his own army, he unleashed a horrifying purge, a chaotic slaughter of Sulla's supporters. The severed heads of distinguished senators were displayed for all to see on the rostra, the speaker's platform in the forum. A few years later, Sulla returned from the east, victorious and bent on revenge. What followed was a bloodbath that dwarfed Marius's terror. Sulla was not just a killer. He was a systematic architect of state-sponsored murder. He declared himself dictator and invented a terrifying new political weapon: the proscriptions. These were officially published lists of his enemies. Any man whose name appeared on a proscription list was stripped of his citizenship and could be hunted down and killed by anyone, for a state-funded reward. His property was confiscated and auctioned off, usually to Sulla's friends, who became fabulously wealthy overnight. This was not just revenge. It was a mechanism of terror that paralyzed the city. A personal grudge, a desirable piece of land, a family rivalry. Any could be enough to get a man's name on the list. Thousands of wealthy Romans were murdered. Trust, the very basis of society, was destroyed. And through all this, a teenager, and then a young man, was watching. Marcus Tullius Cicero was a law student in Rome during these years of horror. This was not ancient history he was reading about in scrolls. It was the world outside his door. He walked the streets where prominent men were cut down. He saw the severed heads displayed on the same rostra where he dreamed of one day speaking. He heard the stories of families destroyed overnight, of sons inheriting nothing but their father's death sentence. This experience was the defining trauma of his youth. It forged in him a deep and abiding horror of civil war, which he would come to see as the greatest of all evils. It instilled in him the unshakable conviction that the only thing that stood between civilization and this kind of bloody chaos was the sanctity of the law and the stability of the state. He saw what happened when great men placed their own ambition above the good of the republic. It was a lesson written in blood, one that he would carry with him for the rest of his life as he prepared to step onto that same deadly political stage. Into this world of blood feuds and crumbling traditions, in the year 106 BC, Marcus Tullius Cicero was born. He was not born in the heart of the city, amidst the great mansions on the Palatine Hill. His life began about 70 miles southeast of Rome, in the quiet, hilly town of Arpinum. While Arpinum had produced the great general Marius, it was still considered provincial, a backwater compared to the metropolis that ruled the world. Cicero's family was not part of the great senatorial aristocracy, the handful of powerful clans known as the nobiles, who had dominated Roman politics for centuries. They did not have ancestors who had held the consulship or were celebrated in the city's history. Instead, the Tullii Cicerones belonged to the Ordo Equester, the equestrian order. This term, which translates as the knights, can be misleading. They were not knights in a medieval sense. The equestrians were the second tier of the Roman elite, a class of wealthy and influential men who were not in the Senate. They were landowners, businessmen, and tax collectors, the backbone of the Roman economy. In their hometown of Arpinum, Cicero's family were local gentry, respected and affluent. They were, in essence, big fish in a small pond. But in the ruthless social and political hierarchy of Rome, they were outsiders. This made Cicero a homo novus, a new man. This Latin phrase means more than just its literal translation. It was a political label, often used with a hint of condescension by the established elite. A homo novus was the very first man in his family's history to break into the closed circle of the Roman Senate and, more importantly, to aim for the highest offices of the state. For the ancient noble families, the Cornelii, the Fabii, the Aemilii, the Senate was their private club, and the consulship was their birthright. They looked down on men like Cicero as ambitious upstarts, social climbers who lacked the breeding and the innate understanding of Roman tradition that they believed flowed through their own veins. They might respect his talent, but they would never truly see him as one of them. This lifelong status as an outsider was the single most important factor in shaping Cicero's personality. It forged within him a complex and often contradictory character. On the one hand, it gave him a relentless, almost desperate ambition. Lacking a famous family name to open doors for him, he knew he had to be better than everyone else. He had to be more intelligent, more hardworking, more persuasive, and more morally upright than any of his aristocratic rivals. He could not rely on the glory of his ancestors. He had to create his own glory, his own dignitas, from scratch, through sheer force of will and intellect. On the other hand, it left him with a deep-seated insecurity. He was acutely aware of his provincial origins and spent his entire life seeking the approval and validation of the very elite that looked down on him. This insecurity often manifested as a pronounced vanity. He talked and wrote about his own achievements endlessly, not just out of arrogance, but out of a need to constantly remind himself and others that he, the man from Arpinum, deserved his place at the top. His enemies found this trait insufferable, and it was a flaw they would ruthlessly exploit. The architect of his ambition was his father, also named Marcus Tullius Cicero. A cultured and intelligent man, though of frail health, he recognized the prodigious intellectual gifts of his two sons, Marcus and his younger brother, Quintus. The elder Cicero may not have had the health or inclination for a public career in Rome, but he was determined that his sons would have the chance he never did. He made a decision that would change the course of their lives. He moved the family to Rome. This was not a move for business or pleasure. It was a strategic relocation with a single overriding purpose: to provide Marcus and Quintus with the finest education available in the ancient world. He knew that for a homo novus, education was not a luxury. It was the only weapon that could possibly allow him to compete with, and ultimately defeat, the entitled sons of the Roman aristocracy. He was making a bet on his son's talent, and it was a bet that would profoundly shape the future of Rome itself. To be a homo novus in Rome was to live in a constant state of proving oneself. It was a relentless psychological battle waged every single day in the corridors of power. When Cicero walked into the Roman Forum, the bustling heart of the Republic, he was not just entering a public space. He was stepping onto a stage where every word, gesture, and acquaintance was scrutinized by men who had inherited their place in the world. When he entered the Curia, the Senate House, he was surrounded by the Cornelii, the Fabii, the Aemilii, men who could casually trace their ancestry back to the founders of the Republic itself. For them, power was an inheritance, a legacy passed down through generations. For Cicero, it was a conquest, a peak to be scaled alone. These aristocrats carried their names like shields, an effortless armor of prestige and authority. Cicero had to forge his own armor piece by piece, with every successful court case, every meticulously researched point of law, and every flawlessly delivered speech. This environment created a ferocious pressure that would define his entire psychological makeup. His legendary work ethic was a direct and necessary consequence of this pressure. He could never afford to be merely good. He had to be exceptional, flawless. While a young nobleman might rely on his family's extensive network of clients and allies to secure a political post, Cicero had to rely on pure, overwhelming competence. He famously wrote that he spent his nights studying and his days in the Forum, leaving little time for rest or recreation. This was not just the discipline of an ambitious man. It was the intense overcompensation of an outsider who knew the rules were different for him. He had to know the law more intimately, construct his arguments more carefully, and anticipate his opponent's moves more skillfully than anyone else, because any mistake he made, any slight misstep, would be judged infinitely more harshly than the blunders of his well-born peers. His ambition, therefore, was not simply a desire for power in the abstract. It was a profound, almost desperate yearning for legitimacy. He wanted to prove to Rome, and perhaps most of all to himself, that virtus, a concept encompassing merit, excellence, courage, and character, was a truer measure of a man than nobilitas, the mere accident of noble birth. This constant need to justify his existence also explains his most famous and heavily criticized character flaw, his vanity. Cicero's letters and speeches are saturated with self-praise. He frequently and unapologetically referred to his own consulship, to his singular role in saving the Republic from Catiline, and to his other achievements. His enemies, and even some later historians, have painted this as simple, unbridled arrogance. And in part it was. But on a deeper level, it was a defense mechanism and a calculated political strategy. In a world where status was everything, he had to be his own herald, his own champion. The great families had generations of history, funeral masks of their ancestors, and public monuments to speak for them. Cicero had only his own voice and his own record. He was, in modern terms, building his personal brand from the ground up, in the most hostile market imaginable. He had to create his own legend in real time, constantly reminding the world of his value because he could not trust the establishment to acknowledge it for him. He even wrote a long epic poem about his own consulship, De Consulata Sua, which was widely mocked for its self-aggrandizing tone, containing the infamous line, "O fortunate Rome, to be born in my consulship." For his critics, it was absurd. For Cicero, it was a necessary act of self-creation. However, this psychology, so effective for his ascent, had a dangerous flip side. His deep-seated need for approval made him intensely sensitive to criticism and at times desperate for the friendship and respect of the very men who were his social superiors. He craved acceptance into their inner circle. While he could be a fierce and uncompromising opponent in the courtroom or the Senate, he often sought to build personal alliances with powerful figures, most notably Pompey the Great. He seems to have mistaken political alignment for genuine friendship, a catastrophic miscalculation. He expected loyalty, gratitude, and a shared commitment to the Republic from men who ultimately saw him as a useful, but entirely disposable political tool. This vulnerability was paired with the one relationship that served as his unwavering anchor: his bond with his younger brother, Quintus. Quintus was more than a sibling. He was Cicero's most trusted advisor, his political agent on the ground, and his emotional sounding board. It is in the priceless collection of his surviving letters to Quintus and to his best friend Atticus that we see the public mask fall away. Here, the confident statesman dissolves, revealing a man racked with anxiety, doubt, and fear. This correspondence is our clearest window into the soul of the outsider, showing the immense personal cost of his public ambition. This internal conflict, the tension between his fierce pride in his achievements and his gnawing insecurity about his status, was the engine that drove him. A man perfectly engineered to climb the treacherous ladder of Roman politics, but perhaps tragically unprepared for the brutal realities he would find waiting for him at the top. Cicero's father had made a strategic bet by moving his family to Rome, and the currency of that bet was education. For the sons of the elite, education polished their inherited status. For Marcus and Quintus Cicero, it was the entire foundation upon which their future would be built. It was their arsenal, and every subject was a different kind of weapon they would need to master for the battles ahead. The curriculum for a young, ambitious Roman was centered on three great pillars: law, philosophy, and the master art that bound them together, rhetoric. Cicero would not just study these subjects. He would absorb them, synthesize them, and ultimately redefine them for the Roman world. The first pillar was law. Rome was a society obsessed with law. It was the operating system of their civilization, governing everything from property inheritance and business contracts to the powers of magistrates and the procedures of war. For a rising politician, a deep knowledge of the law was not optional. It was indispensable. Young Cicero became an apprentice to the most eminent jurists of his day, most notably Quintus Mucius Scaevola Augur, and later his cousin, Quintus Mucius Scaevola Pontifex Maximus. These were not classroom teachers. They were the living repositories of Roman legal tradition. Cicero would follow them through the forum, listening as they gave legal advice to citizens, absorbing the intricate details of the 12 tables and the vast body of civil law. He didn't just memorize statutes. He learned how to interpret them, how to find precedents, how to exploit loopholes, and how to construct a case with unshakable legal logic. For Cicero, the law was the skeleton of any argument. It provided the rigid, unbreakable structure upon which he could later add the flesh of rhetoric and the soul of philosophy. It gave his speeches substance and authority, preventing them from being dismissed as mere empty words. The second pillar was philosophy. Unlike law, philosophy was viewed with suspicion by many practical, hard-headed Romans. They often saw it as a frivolous Greek pastime, a world of abstract and useless debates that distracted from the serious business of politics and war. But Cicero saw it differently. He understood that philosophy was the source of ethics, a guide for living a virtuous life, and, most critically, a vast arsenal of logical arguments. He plunged into the teachings of the major Greek schools with a passion that was unusual for a Roman of his time. From the Stoics, he learned about duty, virtue, and self-control, ideas that would resonate deeply with Roman values and which he would often invoke in his speeches. From the Epicureans, he studied the nature of happiness and the fear of death, which he would later explore in his own philosophical works. But the school that had the most profound impact on him as a budding orator and lawyer was the New Academy, which practiced a form of academic skepticism. The central principle of this school was not to accept any truth as absolute. Instead, they taught the method of arguing in utramque partem, on both sides of every question. An academic skeptic would take a proposition, argue passionately in its favor, and then, with equal skill, turn around and completely demolish his own previous arguments. For a lawyer who needed to be prepared for any counterargument, and for a politician who needed to understand the thinking of his opponents, this was the ultimate intellectual training. It taught him mental flexibility, the ability to see the weaknesses in any position, and the art of constructing and deconstructing arguments at will. Philosophy gave Cicero's oratory its intellectual depth and its moral compass. It allowed him to elevate a simple legal case into a grand debate about justice, duty, and the nature of the republic itself. The third and ultimate pillar was rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking. This was the discipline that would unify law and philosophy and turn them into a devastatingly effective public weapon. His training was grueling and all-encompassing. He studied with the best Greek and Latin masters in Rome. He learned to structure a speech with architectural precision, from the exordium designed to win the audience's goodwill, to the clear narratio or statement of facts, to the logical confirmatio or proof, and the emotionally charged peroratio or conclusion. He practiced endlessly, writing, memorizing, and delivering speeches, often translating the great Greek orators like Demosthenes into Latin, not just to copy them, but to analyze their techniques and absorb their power. Rhetorical training in Rome was also a physical discipline. It involved actio, the art of delivery. Cicero learned how to control his voice, modulating its pitch and volume to create dramatic effect. He mastered the use of posture, gesture, and even facial expressions to reinforce his words and connect with his audience, whether it was a single judge, the entire Senate, or a noisy crowd in the forum. He also trained his memory using sophisticated techniques like the method of loci, or memory palace, which allowed him to deliver incredibly long and complex speeches for hours on end without a single note. Cicero's true genius, the thing that set him apart from all his rivals, was his unique ability to fuse these three disciplines into a single seamless whole. He was not simply a lawyer who knew some philosophy, or a philosopher who knew how to speak. He was a complete intellectual warrior. In his speeches, he would use the unshakable logic of Roman law as his foundation, infuse it with the moral gravity and ethical framework of Greek philosophy, and then unleash it upon his audience with all the persuasive power and artistic beauty of perfected rhetoric. This synthesis was something new in Rome. It was an intellectual force that no one else could match. He was now fully armed. All he needed was a battlefield. Armed with this formidable education, the young Cicero finally had his battlefield, the Roman courts. His first major case would be a trial by fire, a defense of a man named Sextus Roscius against a charge of murdering his own father. It was a case no established lawyer dared to touch, as the accusation was backed by a powerful and ruthless favorite of the dictator Sulla. Cicero took the case and, in a stunning display of courage and rhetorical brilliance, won. The victory made him famous overnight, but it was a dangerous kind of fame. He had publicly humiliated and exposed the greed of men who were part of a murderous regime. While Sulla himself may have been indifferent or even amused by the young lawyer's audacity, the allies of the men Cicero had attacked were not. Rome was suddenly a very dangerous place for him. At the same time, this first great performance had revealed a critical flaw, not in his logic, but in his physical technique. His early oratorical style was explosive and unrestrained. He was naturally thin and did not have a powerful physical constitution. To make an impact, he would speak for hours on end at the top of his lungs, with his entire body tensed and his neck muscles straining. It was effective, but it was physically unsustainable. His friends and doctors were seriously concerned. They warned him that if he continued in this manner, he would burn out his voice or even risk his life. He was a brilliant weapon, but he was in danger of shattering on his very first use. Thus, in the year 79 BC, at the age of 27, Cicero announced he was leaving Rome for an extended journey to Greece and Asia Minor. The official reason was entirely respectable. It was a study tour, a common finishing school for the sons of the elite, designed to deepen their knowledge of philosophy and rhetoric at the source. But this official story concealed two more urgent motives. The first was strategic retreat. He needed to disappear from Rome for a while, to let the anger of his new and powerful enemies cool down. It was a calculated move that showed a political astuteness to match his courtroom bravery. The second motive was self-preservation. He desperately needed to retrain his body and voice, to find a style of speaking that was just as powerful but would not kill him. His first major stop was Athens, the ancient heart of philosophy and learning. For 6 months, he immersed himself in the city's intellectual life, studying again with the great philosophers, particularly Antiochus of Ascalon, the head of the academy. Here, he solidified the philosophical foundations that would give his later work such intellectual weight. He was not just a tourist. He was reinforcing his arsenal. But the most important part of his journey took place on the island of Rhodes, which was home to the most celebrated school of rhetoric in the Mediterranean world. Its master was the formidable Apollonius Molon, a legendary teacher whose students had included other ambitious young Romans, even for a time Julius Caesar. Molon immediately recognized Cicero's immense natural talent, but he was also a harsh critic. He saw that Cicero's style, for all its energy, was undisciplined. He called it Asiatic, a term for a rhetorical style that was overly ornate, bombastic, and self-indulgent. It was full of youthful exuberance but lacked control and gravitas. Molon's task was to tame this wild river of talent and channel it into an unstoppable force. He worked relentlessly with Cicero, teaching him to moderate his delivery. He taught him breathing techniques, how to manage his voice to build to a crescendo without shouting, how to use more restrained and meaningful gestures. He forced Cicero to prune his sentences, to replace florid language with precision and power. He was, in essence, retraining him from a sprinter into a marathon runner. He was teaching him the more controlled, elegant, and ultimately more powerful Attic style of oratory. When Cicero returned to Rome 2 years later, in 77 BC, he was a completely transformed man. The political landscape had changed. The dictator Sulla was dead, and the immediate threat to his life had passed. But the most significant change was in Cicero himself. He was physically stronger and healthier. His voice was richer, more controlled, and more resonant. His delivery was no longer the frantic performance of a young man desperate to impress, but the confident, measured, and masterful presentation of an artist in total command of his craft. The raw, brilliant talent that had won the Roscius case had been sent away to be tempered in the intellectual forges of Greece and Rhodes. The man who returned was a perfected weapon, a finely honed blade, ready to carve his name into the history of Rome. The period of preparation was over. The ascent was about to begin. Cicero had returned to Rome a master of his craft, but to understand the true power of that craft, one must understand the stage on which it was performed. The heart of the Roman Republic, its political, commercial, and social epicenter, was a relatively small open space of land nestled between the Catiline and Palatine hills, the Roman Forum. This was not merely a collection of buildings. It was the nerve center of an empire, the arena where the destiny of the known world was debated and decided, not by armies, but by the power of the human voice. To succeed in Rome, a man had to succeed in the Forum. It was the ultimate proving ground, and here the orator was king. Imagine the scene on any given day. The Forum was a chaotic, vibrant, and noisy river of humanity. Merchants hawked their wares in the Basilici. the great public halls that lined the square. Priests performed sacred rites in the temples that dotted the landscape, their chants mixing with the din of the crowd. Moneylenders clinked coins at their tables. Citizens gathered in groups to gossip, to conduct business, to see and be seen. And everywhere there was politics. Senators in their white togas with purple stripes would walk through the crowds, gathering support and gauging public opinion. Aspiring politicians would work the space, shaking hands and making promises. This was a face-to-face, voice-to-voice society. There was no television, no radio, no internet. A leader's influence was directly proportional to his ability to command the attention of a crowd with his physical presence and the power of his lungs. The focal point of this political theater was the rostra. This was the official speaker's platform, a permanent raised stage from which magistrates addressed the Roman people. Its name, rostra, literally meant the beaks, as it was famously decorated with the bronze prows of enemy warships captured in a great naval victory centuries before. To stand on the rostra was a potent symbol. It was to speak with the authority of the state and the weight of Roman history behind you. From this platform, a consul might propose a new law, a praetor might issue a judicial decree, or a tribune might rally the people against the perceived injustices of the Senate. Speaking before the Concio, the public assembly in the Forum, was a daunting challenge. The crowd was not a polite, seated audience. It was a standing, shifting, and often volatile mass of thousands of citizens from every walk of life. They were a tough audience, quick to heckle a boring speaker or shout down a politician they distrusted. To hold their attention, an orator needed more than just a good argument. He needed a powerful, trained voice that could carry over the noise of the city without the aid of amplification. He needed stamina to speak for hours under the hot Italian sun. And he needed a mastery of psychology, the ability to read the mood of the crowd and adapt his tone, from calm reasoning to fiery passion, to win them over. This was the art of the demagogue and the statesman alike. It was here that a politician built his reputation and his following. A successful speech could make a man the hero of the hour. A poor performance could lead to public humiliation. Beyond the public assemblies, there was another, even more exclusive stage within the Forum. The Curia Hostilia, the Senate House. Here, the audience was entirely different. Instead of a boisterous crowd of citizens, the orator faced a few hundred of the most powerful, experienced, and cynical men in Rome. These were ex-consuls, former generals, and the heads of ancient families. The fiery, emotional appeals that worked on the crowd in the Forum would be met here with cold disdain. Speaking in the Senate required a different set of skills: a deep knowledge of history and law, a cool and logical style of argumentation, and the ability to show deference while still being forceful. A single masterful speech in the Senate could change foreign policy, stop a dangerous law in its tracks, or, as Cicero would later prove, expose a conspiracy to destroy the state. For a homo novus like Cicero, who lacked the military glory of a general or the ancestral prestige of a nobleman, mastery of these two stages, the open forum and the exclusive Senate, was not just an advantage, it was his only path to power. The nobles could rely on their names, the generals on their victories. Cicero had only his intellect and his voice. His words had to be his army. His eloquence had to be his lineage. He had returned from Greece not just as a skilled lawyer, but as a man who had perfected the central, defining weapon of Roman political life. He was ready to enter the arena. Within the grand arena of the Forum, the most intense and consequential dramas often unfolded not on the rostra, but in the law courts. A modern mind imagines a trial as a sober affair, a technical and quiet proceeding confined to a silent courtroom. This image could not be further from the reality of the Roman Republic. Roman trials were loud, passionate, and deeply public spectacles, often held in the open air at a designated spot in the Forum or in the sprawling, echoing halls of the basilicas. They were a form of mass entertainment, a high-stakes performance that could draw a crowd as large and invested as any gladiatorial game. For a Roman advocate, the law was his script, but the courtroom was his stage, and his performance could determine not only his client's fate but his own political future. The very structure of the legal system encouraged this theatricality. A major criminal trial was decided not by a single professional judge, but by a large jury, the quaestio. This jury could be composed of dozens of men, sometimes up to 75, who were not trained legal experts. Depending on the era and the specific court, they were drawn from the ranks of senators or the wealthy equestrian class. They were powerful, influential men, but they were also susceptible to the same emotions, prejudices, and pressures as any other citizen. The advocate's job, therefore, was not merely to present a logical chain of evidence. His primary task was to win the hearts and minds of this jury, to craft a compelling narrative, and to stage a performance so powerful that it would overwhelm the arguments of his opponent. Logic and facts were important, but they were almost always secondary to emotion and character. The art of the Roman advocate was the art of pathos. An advocate defending a man accused of a capital crime would often stage a heart-wrenching scene. He would have the accused appear in court dressed in shabby, mourning clothes, unshaven and weeping. The man's entire family would be brought before the jury. His elderly parents, his distraught wife clutching their small children. The advocate would dramatically point to these innocent, crying figures, asking the jury if they truly had the heart to make this woman a widow and these children orphans. Sometimes, a war hero on trial would be advised to dramatically rip open his tunic to display the scars he had received fighting for the Republic. A silent, powerful appeal to the jury's patriotism. Equally important was the art of character assassination. A significant portion of any trial was dedicated not to the facts of the case, but to a brutal, often slanderous, attack on the character of the opposing litigant. This was called vituperatio. An advocate might spend hours painting his opponent as a degenerate, a drunkard, a coward, an atheist, a man known for his scandalous private life. These accusations often had nothing to do with the alleged crime, but their purpose was to destroy the opponent's credibility and make the jury despise him. It was a brutal, no-holds-barred form of psychological warfare. The goal was to create a simple narrative for the jury. My client is a good, honorable Roman who has fallen on hard times, while my opponent is a wicked, immoral monster who threatens the very fabric of our society. This system was the perfect launching pad for a young, ambitious man like Cicero. High-profile court cases were the primary vehicle for building a political career. There were two main paths. The first was to undertake the defense of a powerful man. If you won his case, he and his entire network of family and friends became your clients. They owed you a debt of gratitude, a gratia, which would be repaid with political support and votes in future elections. A few successful defenses could build a formidable power base. The second, and often more spectacular path, was to act as the prosecutor in a major case, particularly against a corrupt provincial governor. By positioning himself as the champion of the oppressed and the enemy of corruption, a young orator could become a hero to the people, earning immense popularity that would translate directly into electoral success. A brilliant performance in a single, sensational trial could make an unknown man into a political celebrity overnight. It was the Roman equivalent of a viral moment, and it was the path Cicero would masterfully exploit. He had returned from Greece a changed man, a perfected orator. Now, he needed a case, a stage big enough to display his new powers to the entirety of Rome. The year was 80 BC. Sulla's bloody civil war was over, but the peace that followed was the peace of the graveyard. Sulla ruled as dictator, an absolute master with the power of life and death over every person in Rome. The official proscription lists, the public notices for legalized murder, had been closed, but the terror they had unleashed still lingered in the air like a foul mist. The friends and favorites of the dictator had become fabulously wealthy and powerful by seizing the property of the murdered. They operated above the law, their influence casting a long and menacing shadow over the city. No man was more powerful, more feared, and more obscenely wealthy among this new elite than a former slave of Greek origin, a man named Lucius Cornelius Chrysogonus. He was Sulla's right-hand man, his gatekeeper, and the chief beneficiary of the regime's plunder. To cross Chrysogonus was to cross the dictator himself, a mistake no sane man would make. It was in this climate of fear and impunity that a young man named Sextus Roscius of Ameria found himself accused of the most hideous crime a Roman could imagine: parricide, the murder of his own father. In Roman society, the pater familias, the father of the family, held absolute authority. He was the priest of the family cult, the source of its identity and property. To kill one's father was not just murder. It was an act of profound sacrilege, a crime against the state, the family, and the gods themselves. It was considered so unnatural, so monstrous, that the punishment for it was designed to be the ultimate horror, a ritualistic erasure from existence. The convicted parricide was to be stripped, beaten with bloody rods, and then sewn alive into a thick leather sack. Into this dark, suffocating space, 4 animals were placed with him: a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey. The sack was then thrown into the river Tiber, ensuring that the condemned man would have no grave, his body consumed by water, his soul denied rest for eternity. This was the fate that awaited Sextus Roscius if he were found guilty. But the official accusation was a grotesque lie, a cover for a crime that was even more sinister. The victim, the elder Sextus Roscius, was a wealthy and respected landowner, a man who had been a known supporter of Sulla's cause. One evening, while returning from a dinner in Rome, he was ambushed and murdered in the streets. The true culprits were 2 of his own relatives, Titus Roscius Capito and Titus Roscius Magnus, who had long coveted his 13 valuable farms. But they could not simply seize the property. They needed a powerful patron to legitimize their theft. So they went to the master of plunder himself, Chrysogonus. Together, they hatched a scheme of breathtaking audacity and cruelty. Even though the proscription lists had been officially closed for months, Chrysogonus used his influence to have the name of the murdered Sextus Roscius illegally and retroactively added to the list of the proscribed. This single illegal act made the rest of the crime possible. As a proscribed person, the elder Roscius's property now belonged to the state, to be sold at auction. Chrysogonus, in a rigged sale, bought the entire estate, valued at 6 million sesterces, for a mere 2,000. He gave a few of the farms to the murderous relatives as their reward and kept the lion's share for himself. The scheme was almost perfect. There was only one obstacle: the victim's son, the younger Sextus Roscius. He was the rightful heir, the one man who could expose their fraud and reclaim his inheritance. He fled from his family's farms, where his murderous cousins were trying to have him killed, and sought refuge in Rome with a powerful family friend. To silence him permanently and to legally cement their ownership of the stolen land, Chrysogonus and his cronies played their final, diabolical card. They had the son, the very man they had made a homeless orphan, publicly charged with the murder of his own father. They were confident that no one would dare to defend him. The case seemed hopeless. The accusers were backed by the full, terrifying power of Chrysogonus. Any lawyer who took up the defense of Sextus Roscius would not just be arguing a murder case. He would be publicly accusing the dictator's most powerful favorite of conspiracy, theft, and murder. It was an act of professional suicide, and very likely, literal suicide as well. The family and friends of young Roscius went from one famous orator to another, begging the great established advocates of Rome to take the case. All of them, the most experienced and respected men in the courts, refused. The risk was too great. The odds were impossible. The power of Chrysogonus was absolute. Defeated and desperate, with all other doors closed to them, they made one last appeal. They went to a young, ambitious lawyer, a man of 26, known for his talent but with no major victories to his name and no powerful family to protect him. They went to Marcus Tullius Cicero. The greatest orators of Rome had all said no. Now, the fate of Sextus Roscius, and perhaps the future of justice in Rome, rested on his shoulders. When Marcus Tullius Cicero rose to speak in defense of Sextus Roscius, the atmosphere in the forum must have been electric. This was more than a murder trial. It was a moment of public reckoning. Here was a young, unknown advocate, a homo novus, standing up to defend a helpless man against the most powerful and feared figure in the dictator's inner circle. Every established lawyer in Rome had deemed it a suicide mission. The jury, a panel of senators, understood the immense political risk of acquitting a man whose chief accuser was Chrysogonus. A vote against Chrysogonus could easily be interpreted as a vote against Sulla's regime itself, a mistake that could land a man on a future list of enemies. Cicero knew his life, not just his career, was on the line. He was walking a razor's edge, and his strategy had to be a masterpiece of calculated audacity. He did not begin with a direct attack. That would have been fatal. A frontal assault on Chrysogonus would have been seen as an assault on Sulla, and the trial would have ended before it began. Instead, Cicero executed a brilliant rhetorical maneuver that would become a hallmark of his political style. He began his speech, pro ratio Amerino, not by attacking Sulla, but by praising him. He lauded Sulla as the great restorer of the Republic, the man of destiny who had saved Rome from chaos, a figure so occupied with the monumental task of rebuilding the state that he could not possibly be aware of the petty evils being committed in his name by lesser men. He painted a picture of a great, overworked leader, besieged by supplicants and burdened by the affairs of an empire. In such a situation, Cicero argued, is it any wonder that some vultures might take advantage of the great man's diverted attention to carry out their own wicked deeds? This strategy was pure genius. It drove a rhetorical wedge between the dictator and his favorite. It allowed the jury to vote against Chrysogonus without feeling like they were defying Sulla. Cicero was giving them political cover. He was saying, an acquittal for Roscius is not an act of rebellion. It is an act of service to Sulla, for you will be cleansing his glorious victory of the stain brought upon it by this greedy freedman. He completely reframed the narrative. He was not the opposition. He was the true loyalist, defending the honor of the regime against the very parasites it had unfortunately attracted. Having masterfully neutralized the political threat, he then turned to the substance of the case, and his tone shifted from calculated flattery to righteous indignation and withering logic. First, he built an overwhelming wall of sympathy for his client. He painted Sextus Roscius not as a sophisticated urbanite, but as a simple, rustic man of the countryside, a farmer who had spent his life managing his father's estates, completely ignorant of the poisonous intrigues of the capital. He ridiculed the prosecution's motive, asking the jury to look at this plain, unassuming man. Was this truly the face of a monstrous parricide, or was it the face of a bewildered victim, caught in a web he could not comprehend? He systematically dismantled the prosecution's case, which was built on flimsy evidence and contradictory testimony from the murderous Roscius cousins. He proved that his client was not even in Rome on the night of the murder, establishing an alibi that was practically airtight. Once he had firmly established his client's innocence, Cicero pivoted to the offensive. With the jury now on his side, he unleashed a direct, merciless, and unforgettable assault on Chrysogonus himself. He dropped the pretense of politeness and exposed the entire corrupt scheme for all of Rome to see. He thundered against the monstrous greed of this former slave, who now lived in a palace decorated with stolen treasures, while the son of a respectable Roman citizen was a homeless fugitive. He ridiculed Chrysogonus's arrogance, his opulent lifestyle, and his contempt for Roman law and tradition. This was the dramatic heart of the speech. Cicero was no longer just a defense lawyer. He was channeling the unspoken resentment of the entire Roman public. the anger of those who had watched men like Chrysogonus grow rich on the blood and suffering of the civil wars. He was speaking truth to illegitimate power. He concluded with a powerful appeal to the jury, reminding them that this case was about more than one man's fate. It was a test for the rule of law itself. He challenged them to show that Sulla's new order was meant to restore justice, not to protect criminals. Would they allow this blatant injustice to stand, thereby proving that any powerful man could murder and steal with impunity? Or would they stand for the law, protect the innocent, and restore some measure of decency to the Republic? The performance was a triumph. The power of his logic, the passion of his delivery, and the sheer courage of his stand were overwhelming. The jury, emboldened by his arguments and protected by his brilliant political strategy, did the unthinkable. They acquitted Sextus Roscius. The verdict echoed through Rome. Overnight, Marcus Tullius Cicero became a legal and political superstar. He had done what no one thought possible. He had faced down the most feared man in Rome and won. He had proven that he was not only the most talented orator of his generation but also a man of incredible courage. His reputation was made. Cicero had returned from his educational journey in Greece a far more polished and formidable orator. He spent the next few years quietly building his legal practice and, for the first time, beginning his ascent up the political ladder, winning election to his first office as a quaestor, a junior financial magistrate. As fate would have it, he was assigned to serve his term in western Sicily. This was a stroke of immense good fortune. He governed with a rare and scrupulous honesty, ensuring the grain supply to Rome was managed efficiently without exploiting the local farmers. He treated the Sicilians with respect and fairness, a stark contrast to the typical Roman officials they were used to. In his 1 year there, he earned their deep and lasting trust, a trust that would soon lead them back to him, begging him to be their champion in the single greatest legal battle of the generation. This would be the case that would cement his legend, the prosecution of Gaius Verres. To be a Roman governor in the late Republic was to hold the power of a king with almost none of the oversight. A senator would often go deep into debt to win an election, and his term as governor of a province was his one great chance to repay those debts and amass a colossal fortune for himself. The provinces were seen not as territories to be administered, but as estates to be plundered. But even by the depraved standards of his time, the greed and cruelty of Gaius Verres during his 3-year governorship of Sicily from 73 to 71 BC were breathtaking. He was not merely a corrupt official. He was a human predator, a systematic plunderer who treated one of Rome's oldest, wealthiest, and most loyal provinces as his personal treasure chest. His crimes were as varied as they were vast. He had an insatiable lust for Greek art, and he turned Sicily into his private hunting ground. He didn't just buy statues and paintings. He stole them. He sent his agents, known as his hounds, to scout out every city, every temple, and every wealthy private home. If he saw a piece he coveted, a silver vessel, an ancient statue of a god, a priceless painting, he would simply demand it. If the owner refused, he would be threatened with a fabricated lawsuit or worse. He stripped public squares of their monuments, looted the private collections of nobles who had been collecting art for generations, and in his most shocking acts of sacrilege, he even plundered the sacred temples, stealing the very statues of the gods that the people worshipped. He ripped the golden doors from a temple in Syracuse and even tried to steal a massive statue of Hercules, a beloved protector of the city, in a violent nighttime raid that was fought off by the outraged local citizens. For Verres, nothing was sacred. His greed extended far beyond art. He perverted the entire economic and judicial system of the province for his own profit. He imposed illegal and crushing taxes on the farmers, the very men who produced the grain that fed Rome, driving many of them to ruin and forcing them to abandon their fields. He would manipulate the contracts for public works, taking huge kickbacks. He sold justice to the highest bidder, acquitting criminals who could pay his price and condemning innocent men who could not. He even tampered with the inheritance laws, seizing the estates of wealthy Sicilians who had recently died, leaving their children as penniless orphans. He created a reign of terror where no man's property, no man's rights, and no man's dignity were safe from the governor's avarice. But Verres committed one crime that surpassed all others in its horror and its illegality, an act that violated the most sacred principle of Roman identity. The most precious right of a Roman citizen, the right that separated him from all other peoples on earth, was his immunity from degrading punishment, especially crucifixion, which was a death reserved for slaves and rebels. The declaration, Civis Romanus sum, I am a Roman citizen, was meant to be an unbreakable shield. Verres shattered that shield. On several occasions, he had Roman citizens who dared to defy him or appeal against his injustice publicly flogged, tortured, and in one infamous case, crucified. While the man was dying in agony on the cross, looking across the strait towards Italy, he could only scream, I am a Roman citizen. Verres, in a final act of contempt, ordered the cross to be placed facing the mainland, mocking the victim by saying that he could look upon his homeland but never return to it. When news of this specific atrocity reached Rome, it sent a shockwave of outrage through the populace. This was not just corruption, it was tyranny. When Verres's term finally ended, he returned to Rome, confident that his immense stolen fortune could buy him the best lawyers and bribe any jury into acquitting him. But he underestimated the resolve of his victims. A delegation of Sicilians, representing the entire province, traveled to Rome, determined to seek justice. They needed a prosecutor, a patron who would take up their cause. They knew they needed more than just a skilled lawyer. They needed a man of unimpeachable integrity, so he could not be bribed, and a man of immense courage, so he would not be intimidated. And they knew a man who had already proven he possessed both of those qualities, a man who also knew and loved their island. Their choice was obvious. They went to the former quaestor of Sicily, Marcus Tullius Cicero. Accepting the Sicilians' plea was a monumental decision for Cicero. This was not just another court case. It was a declaration of war on the corrupt heart of the Roman establishment. Gaius Verres was not some isolated criminal. He was a member of the high aristocracy, protected by a powerful network of friends and allies in the Senate. He had already hired the undisputed king of the Roman courts, the most famous and successful advocate of the previous generation, Quintus Hortensius Hortulus. Hortensius was a master of the grand theatrical style of oratory, and for years, no one had been able to match him. The upcoming trial was immediately framed as a symbolic duel. The old champion, Hortensius, representing the entrenched, corrupt elite, versus the new challenger, Cicero, the homo novus, representing the ideals of justice and the rights of the provincials. The odds were stacked heavily against him. Verres and Hortensius were supremely confident. Their strategy was not to contest the facts. They knew the evidence of Verres's guilt was overwhelming. Instead, their entire plan was built on cynical delay and political manipulation. They would use every legal trick and procedural loophole to postpone the trial. Their goal was to drag the proceedings out until the end of the year. Why? Because the following year, Verres's close friends were set to take power. Hortensius himself would become one of the two consuls, the highest office in the state, and another ally would become the praetor in charge of the very court hearing the case. With his friends presiding over the government and the judiciary, Verres was certain he could secure a rigged acquittal. He openly boasted that the immense fortune he had stolen was divided into 3 parts. 1 part for his lawyers, 1 part to bribe the jury, and the third, more than enough, for him to live out the rest of his life in luxurious retirement. But they had fundamentally underestimated their opponent. Cicero knew he could not win a conventional battle against Hortensius. A long, drawn-out duel of speeches would play right into the defense's hands, allowing them to stall for time. So he devised a brilliant and completely unorthodox strategy, one that was aggressive, innovative, and relentless. First, instead of staying in Rome to prepare his speeches, he did something almost unheard of for a prosecutor. He personally sailed to Sicily to lead the investigation on the ground. The law allotted him 110 days for this task. He completed it in just 50. For nearly 2 months, he crisscrossed the island, a Roman magistrate on a mission. He faced constant obstruction and intimidation from Verres' remaining allies, who tried to block his access to public records and threaten witnesses. But Cicero was tireless. He went from city to city, auditing account books, examining official documents, and interviewing hundreds of people, from humble farmers to city mayors. He built a mountain of irrefutable evidence, a case so detailed, so documented, and so solid that it was virtually indestructible. When he returned to Rome, he brilliantly outmaneuvered every legal trick Hortensius threw at him to delay the start of the trial, forcing the case to be heard immediately. The stage was set. The forum was packed. All of Rome was buzzing with anticipation, expecting a spectacular, weeks-long oratorical battle between the two giants of the Roman bar. And then Cicero did the unexpected. He rose to speak, but instead of launching into a long, detailed opening argument as everyone expected, he delivered his first speech, the Actio Prima in Verrem, which was a masterpiece of brevity, power, and psychological warfare. In it, he did not just lay out the crimes of Verres. In a stunning turn, he put the entire senatorial jury on trial in the court of public opinion. He warned them that the people of Rome were disgusted with their corruption, that this trial was their last chance to prove that a court of senators was capable of rendering true justice. If they failed, if they allowed this monster to be acquitted, he warned, the people would surely rise up and strip them of their judicial powers forever. Having delivered this short, sharp shock, he played his trump card. He announced that he would waive his right to a long follow-up speech. He would not engage in a rhetorical duel with Hortensius. Instead, he would proceed immediately to the evidence. He began to call his witnesses. What followed was one of the most dramatic scenes in the history of Roman law. It was a relentless, uninterrupted parade of human suffering and official depravity. Day after day, a seemingly endless stream of Sicilian witnesses took the stand. Mayors described the public monuments their cities had lost. Ship captains recounted how Verres' negligence had cost Roman lives. Farmers told heartbreaking stories of losing their ancestral lands. One after another, they told their stories, their testimonies backed by the account books and documents Cicero had brought with him. The sheer, overwhelming weight of the evidence, presented not through a lawyer's filter but through the raw, emotional testimony of the victims themselves, was devastating. The defense completely collapsed. The great Hortensius was silenced, barely able to speak. Before Cicero had even presented half of his evidence, the battle was over. Humiliated, exposed, and seeing no hope of acquittal, Gaius Verres did the only thing he could. He gave up. He packed his bags with some of his stolen treasures and fled from Rome into a life of voluntary exile. Cicero's victory was absolute. He had not just defeated Verres, he had dethroned Hortensius and established himself, without a shadow of a doubt, as the greatest orator and advocate in Rome. The path to the highest offices of the Republic was now wide open. The colossal victory in the Verres trial transformed Cicero from a mere legal celebrity into a political titan, a genuine force to be reckoned with. He was now the undisputed champion of the people, a man respected for his integrity and feared for his eloquence. With the immense popularity and authority he had earned, he now fixed his gaze firmly on the ultimate prize in Roman public life, the consulship. But in Rome, one did not simply run for the highest office. It was the final step on a long, arduous, and strictly regulated career path known as the Cursus Honorum, the path of honors. This was the formal sequence of public offices that an ambitious Roman had to hold to climb the ladder of power. It was a system designed to ensure that no man reached the top without first acquiring extensive experience in the lower rungs of administration and government. For a nobleman from a consular family, ascending this ladder was an expectation. For a homo novus like Cicero, it was a nearly impossible climb, with every rung contested by the entrenched aristocracy. The ladder began with the office of quaestor. Quaestors were financial administrators, responsible for managing the state treasury, the aerarium, or assisting a governor with the finances of a province. We have already seen how Cicero's term as quaestor in Sicily was a model of honesty and competence. It was a role many used to enrich themselves, but Cicero used it to build a reputation for justice, earning the lifelong loyalty of the Sicilians. Upon successful completion of a term as quaestor, a man was granted the ultimate social prize: lifetime membership in the Roman Senate. At the age of 30, Cicero, the man from Arpinum, had officially broken into the most exclusive club in the world. The next step, a few years later, was the office of aedile. The aediles were in charge of the domestic affairs of the city of Rome itself. They were the commissioners of public works, responsible for maintaining temples, roads, and aqueducts. They supervised the public markets, ensuring fair trade and regulating the crucial grain supply. But their most important and visible duty was the staging of public games and religious festivals. This office was a massive test of popularity and a huge drain on personal finances. The Roman public expected ever more lavish and spectacular games, and a successful aedile was expected to spend enormous sums of his own money to win their favor. For wealthy aristocrats, this was a chance to flaunt their fortunes. For Cicero, who was not nearly as rich, it was a challenge. He handled the office with characteristic intelligence. He put on games that were dignified and impressive but not ruinously extravagant. Instead, he won his popularity by focusing on the less glamorous but more essential duties of the office, once again ensuring that the price of grain for the common people was fair and stable. He proved that a man could be popular through competence and fairness, not just by throwing money at the mob. After the aedileship came the critically important office of praetor. This was a significant leap in power and authority. The praetors were the senior judicial officials of the Republic. They were the chief judges of Rome. They presided over the most important criminal and civil courts, the very courts where Cicero had made his name as an advocate. A praetor also possessed imperium, the authority to command an army, and after his term in the city, he could be sent to govern a province. To be elected praetor was to enter the upper echelons of the Roman state. In 66 BC, Cicero was elected praetor, and he won the most prestigious position of all, that of the praetor urbanus, the chief justice for cases between Roman citizens. From the bench where he had once shone as a lawyer, he now dispensed justice for the entire city. What was truly extraordinary about Cicero's ascent was not just that he held these offices, but when he held them. For each step on the ladder, quaestor, aedile, and praetor, he was elected in sua anno, a Latin phrase meaning in his year. This meant he won the election at the absolute minimum legal age allowed for that office. For a nobleman with a famous name and immense family resources, achieving this was a mark of great distinction. For a homo novus, a provincial outsider with no ancestral connections, to win every single election at the first possible opportunity was nothing short of a political miracle. It demonstrated a level of overwhelming popularity and cross-factional support that was virtually unprecedented. It showed that his appeal transcended the normal political divisions. The common people loved him for prosecuting vires. Moderate nobles respected him as a defender of law and property. And powerful figures like Pompey the Great saw him as a talented and valuable ally. He had flawlessly navigated the treacherous waters of Roman politics. After his successful year as praetor, only one rung remained on the ladder. It was the highest, the most glorious, the ultimate ambition of every Roman who entered public life: the consulship. He would be running for an office that the nobility considered their exclusive property, and they would do everything in their power to stop this upstart from Arpinum from reaching the final peak. The year was 64 BC. As the sun rose over Rome, the city was already simmering with the fever of an impending election, one that promised to be the most vicious and consequential in living memory. At the center of this political firestorm was Marcus Tullius Cicero. Having flawlessly ascended every step of the Cursus Honorum at the earliest possible age, he now stood at the precipice of his ultimate ambition. He was running for Consul of the Roman Republic. This was the final, highest peak, the office that conferred upon a man supreme civil and military authority for 1 year. To hold it was to be, for a time, the most powerful man in the world. For the great noble families, the consulship was a prize to be passed amongst themselves. But for Cicero, the homo novus from Arpinum, it was everything. It was the culmination of his father's dreams, the justification for a life of relentless work, and the ultimate validation of his status as a true Roman leader. But the path to the summit was guarded by formidable and dangerous rivals. The field of candidates was crowded, but 2 men stood out as his principal opponents, both of them nobles, and both of them deeply flawed. The first was Gaius Antonius Hybrida, the uncle of the future Mark Antony. Hybrida was an aristocrat with a tarnished reputation, a man who had been expelled from the Senate for corruption earlier in his career and was known to be drowning in debt. He was a political opportunist, not a man of principle, but he had a noble family name which still carried immense weight. He was a serious, if uninspiring, contender. The second opponent, however, was a figure of a different kind entirely. He was a man of dark charisma and terrifying ambition, a man who would become the great antagonist of Cicero's life: Lucius Sergius Catilina, or Catiline. Catiline was the walking embodiment of the Republic's decay. He was a patrician, descended from one of the most ancient but now impoverished families in Rome. He possessed a magnetic personality and a reckless courage that drew disaffected souls to him like moths to a flame. But his past was stained with rumors of the most heinous crimes: extortion, murder, and even the suspected killing of his own wife and son. He had been a brutal lieutenant during Sulla's reign of terror, a past that still clung to him. Having failed to win the consulship before, and now facing financial ruin, Catiline ran on a radical and explosive platform. He presented himself as the champion of the downtrodden, the indebted, and the dispossessed. His central promise was a revolutionary policy known as tabulae novae, new tables, which meant the complete and total cancellation of all debts. This message was political poison to the wealthy elite, but it was a siren song to a vast and dangerous coalition. Other ruined aristocrats, disgruntled veterans of Sulla's wars who had lost their land, impoverished farmers, and the desperate urban poor of Rome. Catiline was not just a politician. He was the potential leader of a violent revolution. The campaign that followed was a brutal street fight. Roman elections were not won through quiet debate, but through relentless personal campaigning. We have a remarkable guide to this process, a handbook on electioneering supposedly written for Cicero by his brother Quintus. Whether authentic or not, it paints a vivid picture. Quintus advised his brother to be a political chameleon, to promise everything to everyone. Make sure your handshake is firm, learn to remember names, and surround yourself at all times with a great entourage, he wrote. A candidate had to be seen everywhere, constantly moving through the forum, greeting potential voters, attending dinners, and making strategic alliances. Cicero, the ultimate outsider, had to build a coalition from scratch. He brilliantly cobbled together a diverse base of support. He had the unwavering loyalty of the equestrian order, his own social class. He had the gratitude of the common people, who remembered him as the man who brought down Verres. He had powerful allies in the Italian countryside. But his most crucial support came from an unexpected source: the very aristocracy that had once looked down on him. While many nobles still despised him as an upstart, they were terrified of Catiline. They saw Cicero, with his profound respect for law and property, as the lesser of two evils. He was the safe choice, the one man with the talent and the popular support to stop the dangerous revolutionary. Cicero masterfully exploited this fear. He transformed the election into a referendum on the future of the Republic itself, a choice between his platform of stability and order, odium cum dignitate, peace with dignity, and Catiline's promise of chaos and bloody revolution. He presented himself as the bulwark, the guardian of the established order. When the votes were counted, the result was a political earthquake. Cicero had won, and he had won overwhelmingly, finishing in first place with a massive plurality of the votes. Gaius Antonius Hybrida scraped into second place, securing the other consulship, while Catiline was defeated, left to nurse his bitterness and plot his revenge. For Cicero, it was the greatest moment of his life. The man from Arpinum, the homo novus, had been elected Consul of Rome, and he had done it in sua anno at his first attempt. The crowd in the Campus Martius, the field where the voting took place, would have carried him on their shoulders, a triumphant procession back to his home. He had reached the summit. He was the master of the Roman world. He had dreamed of this moment, fought for it, and now it was his. But as he celebrated his triumph, the shadow of his defeated rival loomed large. The victory he had just won, the greatest achievement of his life, was about to lead him directly into the greatest and most dangerous crisis the Republic had faced in a generation. Cicero's consulship had begun in triumph, but the man he had defeated in the election, Lucius Sergius Catilina, did not simply fade into the background. Defeat had not humbled him. It had curdled his ambition into a poisonous rage. With the legitimate path to power now closed to him forever, he decided he would take by force what he could not win by votes. To understand the crisis that would define Cicero's year as consul, we must first understand the man who instigated it. For Catiline was no common criminal or simple rebel. He was a terrifying and magnetic figure, a perfect monster bred from the decay of the Republic itself. He was a patrician of the bluest blood. The gens Sergia, his family line, was one of the oldest in Rome, claiming descent from a companion of the legendary Aeneas. But their glory was ancient history. For centuries, his family had failed to produce any men of great distinction, and their fortunes had dwindled away. Catiline was thus a man possessed by a toxic combination of immense ancestral pride and profound personal insecurity. He felt entitled to the power and wealth that his name suggested, yet he lacked the means to acquire them through conventional channels. This created in him a gnawing resentment against the newer, wealthier noble families who now dominated the state, and a burning desire to restore his own fortunes and glory, no matter the cost. The historian Sallust, who wrote the definitive account of the conspiracy, left behind a vivid and chilling portrait of the man. He described Catiline as possessing a powerful body, capable of enduring incredible hardship, cold, heat, and lack of sleep. But this strong vessel contained a wicked and depraved soul. He was audacious, deceitful, and volatile, capable of pretending to be anyone or anything to get what he wanted. He was a master of manipulation, a man who possessed a dark, predatory charisma that many found irresistible. He could be a loyal and generous friend to those who followed him, creating a band of followers who were fanatically devoted to him. But he was also capable of shocking brutality. His hands were stained with the blood of Sulla's proscriptions, where he had acted as one of the dictator's most enthusiastic executioners, reportedly torturing and killing his own brother-in-law with his own hands. His personal life was a whirlwind of scandal, debt, and rumored depravity. He was a man with nothing left to lose and an infinite capacity for destruction. After his electoral defeat, Catiline began to gather around him a fellowship of the damned, a dangerous coalition of all the disaffected and desperate elements of Roman society. His inner circle was composed of other ruined nobles, men like himself who had squandered their inheritances on luxurious living and were now drowning in debt. For them, a violent revolution and the cancellation of debts was not a political position. It was the only possible escape from bankruptcy and humiliation. Then there were the disgruntled veterans of Sulla's wars. These were men who had been rewarded with plots of land for their service, but many had failed as farmers or had been cheated out of their property. They were now idle, impoverished, and most dangerously, highly trained in the arts of war, their loyalty for sale to any commander who promised them plunder. Beyond this core, his appeal spread wider. He drew support from the rural poor, farmers who had been pushed off their land by the great estates and were now ripe for rebellion. He had a following among the desperate urban mob in Rome, who saw in him a champion who would tear down the system that kept them in poverty. His conspiracy even attracted a number of aristocratic women, who, despite their high birth, were also crippled by debt from their extravagant lifestyles. They saw in Catiline's victory a chance to be free of their financial obligations and perhaps even to see their husbands killed, opening the way for new, more powerful alliances. What united all these disparate groups was a shared sense of desperation, a mountain of debt, and a burning desire to smash the existing order. In the shadows, throughout the summer of 63 BC, the conspiracy took shape. Catiline was no longer a candidate. He was a revolutionary general planning a military campaign. He established a secret headquarters in Etruria, north of Rome, under the command of a former Sullan centurion named Manlius. This became the rendezvous point for his army of veterans and disgruntled farmers. Weapons were being secretly stockpiled and distributed. Inside the city of Rome, his co-conspirators were assigned their roles. They were to be the urban terror cell. Their plan was as simple as it was savage. On a designated night, they would assassinate the senior senators and magistrates, most especially the man who stood as the symbol of the establishment they despised, the consul Marcus Tullius Cicero. Simultaneously, they would set fires in multiple parts of the city to create mass panic and chaos. As Rome burned and its leaders lay dead, Catiline and his army from Etruria would march on the capital, seize control, and install him as the new master of the state. It was a plan to drown the Republic in blood, and as the chief guardian of that Republic, Cicero was completely unaware of the precise nature of the storm that was gathering, a storm that was aimed directly at his head. As consul, Cicero was now the guardian of the Roman state, but he was a guardian fighting in the dark. He knew Catiline was a venomous serpent, wounded and enraged by his defeat, but he did not yet know the precise nature of the venom or when it would strike. Catiline, meanwhile, played a masterful game of deception. He continued to walk the streets of Rome as a senator, his head held high. He attended meetings in the Senate, sat among the very men he planned to murder, and calmly denied any rumors of treason with a patrician's arrogant sneer. Many senators, especially those who were secretly in debt and sympathetic to Catiline's cause, wanted to believe him. They dismissed the whispers as political smears, the paranoid fantasies of a new consul desperate to make a name for himself. Cicero was in a waking nightmare. He was the one man in Rome who suspected the full, horrifying scope of the danger, but he had no concrete proof. To act without it would be political suicide. To wait for it might be a death sentence for the Republic. The breakthrough came not from a soldier or a professional spy, but from the boudoir of a Roman aristocrat. The conspiracy's first great weakness was the vanity and indiscretion of its own members. One of the key conspirators in the city was a man named Quintus Curius. Like many of Catiline's followers, he was a nobleman of high birth who had been expelled from the Senate for his scandalous behavior and was now drowning in debt. Curius had a long-standing affair with a well-known and intelligent noblewoman named Fulvia. As the conspiracy gathered steam, Curius, filled with a sense of his own impending importance, became boastful. In his private moments with Fulvia, he began to drop hints of a great change that was coming. He promised her seas and mountains, bragging that soon he would be a man of immense power. When she mocked him for his empty promises, his pride was stung, and he began to reveal specific, dangerous details of Catiline's plot. The planned assassinations, the fires, the coming revolution. Fulvia was no saint, but she was not a revolutionary. Alarmed by the sheer scale of the madness her lover was describing, she understood the terrible danger facing the state. Whether motivated by a spark of patriotism, a fear for her own safety, or simply the realization that this information was the most valuable currency she possessed, she made a fateful decision. She began to secretly pass everything Curius told her to the one man who would listen, the consul Cicero. Suddenly, Cicero had a direct line into the heart of the conspiracy. He now had a source, an intelligence asset. He became a spymaster overnight, operating a clandestine network from his own home. He cultivated Fulvia, urging her to continue her relationship with Curius, to press him for more names, more dates, more details. Through her, he learned about the secret army gathering in Etruria under Manlius and the identities of the key plotters inside the city. But his problem remained the same. His information, though detailed, was inadmissible. It was second-hand, the pillow talk of a boastful traitor reported by his mistress. He could not march into the Senate and present this as evidence. His enemies would laugh him out of the Curia. He was walking a tightrope, balancing the need for secrecy with the urgent need to persuade the Senate that the danger was real. He began to take his own precautions. He increased his personal security, surrounding himself with a larger retinue of loyal clients and friends whenever he walked in public. His house became a fortress. And in a move that shows the profound breakdown of civic order, he began to wear a larica, a bronze breastplate, hidden beneath his toga. The chief magistrate of Rome, the embodiment of civil law, was secretly wearing armor in the heart of his own city, expecting an assassin's dagger at any moment. The moment of truth arrived in the first week of November. The conspirators, growing impatient, held a secret late-night meeting. They decided the time for delay was over. The first blow must be struck. Two of them, a senator and an equestrian, volunteered for the most critical task, the assassination of Cicero. Their plan was simple and brazen. They would go to Cicero's house the next morning at dawn, under the pretext of paying the traditional morning visit, the salutatio, where a great man received his clients. Once admitted into his home, they would corner him and stab him to death. But Cicero's intelligence network was working perfectly. Through Fulvia, who had learned of the plan from a frantic Curius, Cicero received a warning in the dead of night. He was told the exact plan, and the names of the men who were coming to kill him. As dawn broke over Rome, the two would-be assassins arrived at Cicero's house as planned. But instead of the usual quiet morning reception, they found the doors barred and the entrance swarming with armed guards who had been ordered to refuse them entry. Their plot was foiled. For Cicero, this was the final, chilling confirmation. The threat was no longer a matter of rumor or second-hand reports. It had come to his own doorstep. The conspiracy had revealed its murderous intent in a direct, undeniable act. He still lacked physical evidence that would stand up in a court of law, but he now possessed the absolute moral certainty of the truth. The secret war of spies and informants was over. The time had come to confront the serpent in the open. The morning of November 8, 63 BC, dawned with a chilling tension over Rome. The assassins had come to Cicero's door and failed. The conspiracy was no longer a shadowy threat. It was a tangible, murderous reality that had breathed on his neck. Cicero knew he could not wait another moment. Armed with the irrefutable knowledge of his near assassination, he acted with decisive speed. He summoned an emergency meeting of the Senate. But he did not convene them in their usual meeting place, the Curia Hostilia in the Forum. That building was too open, too vulnerable. Instead, he chose a location that was both a symbol and a fortress. the Temple of Jupiter Stator on the Palatine Hill. The name of the temple itself meant Jupiter the Stayer, the god who stopped a Roman retreat in a legendary battle. By meeting there, Cicero was sending a powerful unspoken message. Here the Republic would make its stand. Here the flight from chaos would be stopped. The senators gathered, their faces etched with anxiety and uncertainty. They knew the consul had called them for a matter of life and death, but the full picture was still a mystery to many. The air was thick with rumor and fear. And then the unthinkable happened. Through the great bronze doors of the temple, a single figure walked in, calm and composed, as if it were any other day of business. It was Lucius Sergius Catilina. His audacity was breathtaking. He, the man who had ordered the consul's murder just hours before, now took his place among the very men he sought to destroy, his expression a mask of aristocratic indifference. But this time his presence was poison. As he moved to take his seat on the senatorial benches, a silent, spontaneous wave of revulsion swept through the chamber. The senators sitting near him stood up and physically moved away. The men on the other side of him did the same. Within moments, he was left utterly alone, a solitary toxic figure on a long empty bench, a gaping space of condemnation surrounding him. The entire Senate had just convicted him without a single word being spoken. All eyes turned to the consul. Cicero, wearing his breastplate beneath his toga, rose from his curule chair. He was filled with a righteous, controlled fury. This was the moment his entire life, his entire education had prepared him for. He still lacked the kind of physical evidence, signed letters, captured weapons, that would allow him to legally arrest and execute a senator. But he had a different kind of weapon, and he now aimed it directly at the heart of the man sitting isolated before him. He did not address the Senate. He did not speak to the presiding magistrate. He turned his gaze directly upon Catiline, and from his lips came the most famous opening of any speech in history, a thunderclap of accusation that has echoed for 2 millennia. Quo usque tandem abudera Catilina, patientia nostra? How long at last, Catiline, will you abuse our patience? What followed was not a debate. It was a verbal execution. Cicero, with his intelligence network's information as his ammunition, proceeded to vivisect Catiline in public. He laid the entire conspiracy bare. He spoke of the secret meetings, naming the dates and locations. He described the army gathering in Etruria under Manlius. He spoke of the designated assassination targets, of the plan to set the city ablaze. He even revealed the details of the failed murder plot at his own home that very morning, describing how he had barred his doors to Catiline's assassins. He was painting a picture so detailed, so specific, that it had the undeniable ring of truth. He was showing Catiline and the entire Senate that he knew everything. He was creating a verbal cage, bar by bar, from which there was no escape. His strategy was as brilliant as it was unorthodox. He was not trying to persuade the Senate to arrest Catiline. He knew that was legally impossible and politically risky. His true goal was to psychologically break Catiline himself. He wanted to isolate him, to terrify him, to expose him so completely that his position in the city would become untenable. He openly taunted him. "Leave the city. Your camp in Etruria longs for you as its commander. Take all your followers with you. Cleanse the city." This was the masterstroke. He was not exiling Catiline. He was daring him to leave. Catiline's flight from Rome to join an armed encampment of rebels would be the one thing Cicero did not yet have: a public, undeniable confession of treason. It was a high-stakes gamble, a brilliant piece of political theater designed to force his enemy's hand. Stunned into silence by the onslaught, Catiline finally rose to respond. He tried to play the role he knew best: the persecuted patrician, the victim of a tyrannical consul. With a trembling voice, He pleaded with the senators not to believe the wild accusations of this arrogant new man, this immigrant from Arpinum. He, a Sergius, a man of ancient lineage, was a true patriot, while this upstart was the real threat to the state. But his words were hollow, his performance unconvincing. He had been so thoroughly exposed that no one was listening. As his speech faltered, the senators, who had been listening to Cicero in rapt, horrified silence, finally erupted. They began to heckle him, then to shout. Cries of traitor, assassin, enemy of the state, rained down on him from all sides. The collective judgment of his peers, the class whose respect he secretly craved, broke over him like a tidal wave. Humiliated, shaking with impotent fury, and utterly defeated, Catiline spat out a final desperate threat, screaming that if they were determined to burn him down, he would extinguish the flames and the rubble of the entire republic. He then turned, stormed out of the temple, and that very night, just as Cicero had willed it, he fled the city of Rome, taking the road north to join his waiting army. The first, critical battle was over. Cicero's words had struck their target with lethal precision. The serpent had been driven from its nest. Catiline's flight was a huge victory for Cicero, but it was an incomplete one. The serpent's head had been driven from the city, but its body, a cell of his most determined and high-ranking co-conspirators, remained coiled in the heart of Rome, ready to strike. The leader of this urban faction was a man named Publius Cornelius Lentulus Sura, an arrogant and deeply indebted former consul who believed a prophecy foretold that he would be the third Cornelius to rule Rome, after Sulla and another ancient ancestor. Alongside him were other desperate aristocrats, including a man named Sextus, who was notoriously impatient and eager to begin the slaughter. Their plan was still active. Once they received news of Catiline's army advancing, they were to carry out their assigned tasks of assassination and arson. The immediate danger had not passed. In some ways, it had intensified. The conspiracy was now a decapitated beast, thrashing in its death throes, making it unpredictable and even more dangerous. Cicero knew he had to neutralize this internal threat, but his old problem persisted, now in a new form. He had driven Catiline away with words, but to arrest Roman senators and patricians within the city, he needed more than accusations. He needed cold, hard, physical proof. He needed evidence that would be so undeniable that no one could accuse him of acting as a tyrant. And then, in a stroke of incredible fortune, the conspirators, in their arrogance and desperation, made a fatal amateurish mistake. They decided they needed to bring a new element into their plot, a foreign ally. In Rome at the time was a delegation from the Allobroges, a Gallic tribe from what is now southern France. They were in the city to complain to the Senate about the crushing debts and exploitation they suffered at the hands of their Roman governors. The conspirators saw an opportunity. They reasoned that this disaffected tribe would be a perfect ally, able to provide cavalry for Catiline's army. One of the plotters approached the Gallic envoys, revealed the entire conspiracy, and invited them to join the revolution. The Allobroges were in a difficult position. They had legitimate grievances against Rome, but they were also pragmatic men. They weighed the vague promises of a rebel army against the proven terrifying power of the Roman state. They made the smart choice. They went straight to their Roman patron and told him everything. The patron, in turn, immediately informed Cicero. The consul now had his golden opportunity, not just to confirm the plot, but to capture the irrefutable evidence he craved. He instructed the Gallic envoys to play along. They were to pretend to agree to join the conspiracy, but with one condition. They needed, they said, a signed and sealed letter from each of the leading conspirators, Lentulus, Sextus, and the others. This written oath, they claimed, was the only way they could convince their people back in Gaul to rise in revolt. Incredibly, the conspirators, blinded by their belief that victory was near, fell into the trap. They were so inept that they provided the Gallic envoys with exactly what they asked for. letters detailing their plans and bearing their personal seals, a legally binding form of signature. It was the equivalent of a signed confession. Cicero's plan was now in motion. In the dead of night, as the Gallic delegation was leaving Rome by the northern road, they were ambushed at the Milvian Bridge by a force of praetors and guards that Cicero had hidden there in advance. The envoys, playing their parts perfectly, offered no resistance. The letters were seized. The conspirators, who had been escorting the Gauls out of the city, were arrested on the spot. Cicero finally had it. He held in his hands the physical proof of their treason. The next morning, he convened the Senate and staged his final dramatic masterstroke. He brought in the arrested conspirators one by one. He presented the captured letters. When confronted with their own handwriting and their own personal seals, each man's composure shattered. They confessed everything. The guilt of the men was now beyond any doubt. The Senate, which had been so divided and skeptical just weeks before, was now united in its horror and its condemnation. Catiline's army was still a threat in the north, and the city had narrowly averted a massacre. The senators voted to thank Cicero for his vigilance and to place the conspirators under house arrest. But now, Cicero and the entire Senate faced a new and far more profound dilemma. The question was no longer about guilt or innocence. The question was about punishment. What was to be done with these men? This question tore open one of the deepest legal and moral fissures in the Roman Republic. On one side was the immediate, terrifying reality of the situation. A rebel army was in the field, a terror plot had almost succeeded, and the captured men were the leaders of a planned insurrection. To keep them alive was to risk them escaping, becoming a rallying point for other rebels, or being rescued if Catiline's army drew nearer. State security seemed to demand their immediate and final elimination. On the other side was one of the most sacred and fundamental laws of the Roman state, the right of provocatio ad populum. This ancient law guaranteed that no Roman citizen could be put to death by a magistrate without first being granted a full trial and the chance to appeal the verdict to the entire Roman people for a final vote. It was the bedrock of Roman civil liberty, the ultimate protection against tyrannical state action. Cicero, as consul, was now trapped. If he followed the law and granted the conspirators a trial, he risked the security of the state. If he bypassed the law and executed them on the authority of the Senate alone, he would be saving the state by breaking its most fundamental rule, an act that his enemies could and would later brand as tyranny. On December 5th, he convened the Senate for the final, fateful debate. The life of the Republic and his own future hung on its outcome. The Senate chamber on the 5th of December was the scene of one of the most consequential debates in Roman history. The fate of 5 captured conspirators lay in the balance, and with them, the fate of Roman law itself. The first senior senator to speak, the consul-elect for the following year, proposed the ultimate penalty: death. One by one, the other former consuls rose to concur. The mood of the chamber was grim, vengeful, and leaning heavily towards a swift and final solution. It seemed a foregone conclusion. And then a man rose to speak who would change the entire dynamic of the debate. He was a man of immense charm, towering intellect, and a political ambition that would one day shatter the Republic. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar was a praetor-elect at the time, a rising star in the populist faction, but he was also a man under a cloud of suspicion. His known political sympathies with figures like Catiline and his own heavy debts led some to whisper that he might have been secretly involved in the conspiracy himself. He knew he was in a precarious position. His speech had to be a masterpiece of political maneuvering, and it was. He did not defend the conspirators. To do so would have been political suicide. He began by condemning their plot in the strongest possible terms, calling it a monstrous crime against the state. But then, with cool, deliberate logic, he argued passionately against the death penalty. His reasoning was not based on mercy, but on law and precedent. He reminded his fellow senators of a fundamental sacred principle. No Roman citizen could be executed without a proper trial. He warned them that to ignore this law, even in a time of crisis, was to create a terrible and dangerous precedent. All bad precedents, he argued, arise from good beginnings. He pointed out that they, the Senate, felt justified now because the state was in danger and the men were clearly guilty. But what would happen in the future? What if another, less virtuous consul, backed by an army, decided to use this very decision, this senatus consultum ultimum, as a justification to execute his own political enemies without trial, claiming a national emergency? By breaking the law to save the state today, they would be handing a weapon to every future tyrant who wished to destroy it. It was a brilliantly forward-thinking argument. Instead of death, he proposed a novel and, in his view, harsher punishment: life imprisonment in different fortified towns across Italy, and the permanent confiscation of all their property. Death, Caesar argued, was a release from all suffering. A life of isolated, impoverished misery was a far more fitting and lasting punishment for their crimes. The speech was so powerful, so logical, and so legally sound that it stunned the Senate. The mood began to shift. Senators who had previously called for death began to waver, persuaded by Caesar's irrefutable logic. Even Cicero's own brother, Quintus, was seen nodding in agreement. It seemed that Caesar had won the day. But then another man rose to his feet, a man who was the living antithesis of Caesar in every way. He was Marcus Porcius Cato, known to history as Cato the Younger. Cato was not a brilliant politician or a charming speaker. He was something far more formidable. He was the unshakable moral conscience of Rome. A devout Stoic, he was a man of absolute, uncompromising integrity who disdained political maneuvering and saw the world in stark terms of right and wrong. He was the great-grandson of Cato the Censor, a legendary figure of old Roman virtue, and he modeled his entire life on this severe ancestral ideal. As Caesar was the master of expediency, Cato was the high priest of principle. And his principle now was that the state was at war. His speech was not clever or subtle. It was a blast of severe, righteous fury. He began by chastising his fellow senators for even debating the issue. He accused them of a soft, effeminate weakness, of worrying about their villas and their silverware while the Republic was on the verge of collapse. "We are not debating the punishment for a crime," he thundered. "We are fighting for our survival." He dismissed Caesar's legal arguments as irrelevant and dangerous sophistry. These men, he argued, were not citizens awaiting trial. They had, by taking up arms against their country, forfeited their citizenship. They were hosts, public enemies, captured in the act of waging war. One does not grant a trial to an enemy soldier captured on the battlefield. One eliminates the threat. He accused Caesar of secretly pitying the enemies of the state and reminded the Senate of the harsh, decisive virtues of their ancestors, who would not have hesitated for a moment. He argued that any delay, any sign of indecision, would be seen as weakness by Catiline's army in the field, encouraging them to fight harder. The only way to save Rome was with swift, decisive, and ruthless action. He demanded the death penalty, not as a punishment, but as an act of war. The effect of Cato's speech was electrifying. It was a moral clarion call that swept away all of Caesar's careful legal reasoning. Cato had reframed the debate entirely. This was no longer a legal question. It was a test of Roman courage and resolve. His stark, simple, and powerful argument resonated far more deeply with the frightened and angry senators than Caesar's complex and forward-looking one. One by one, the senators who had been swayed by Caesar now swung back, convinced by Cato's moral certainty. The debate was over. A clear majority now favored the ultimate penalty. Cato had won. But he had only won the argument. The terrible, final responsibility for carrying out the sentence, for acting on the Senate's will and taking the lives of Roman citizens without trial, now fell squarely and solely upon the shoulders of one man, the consul Marcus Tullius Cicero. The vote was cast. The debate was over. A wave of grim relief washed over the Senate, the relief of men who had made a hard choice and could now pass the terrible burden of action to another. All eyes in the Curia now rested on the consul, Marcus Tullius Cicero. Cato's fierce morality had won the argument, but Cicero was the one who would have to bear the legal and historical consequences. He was the state's chief executive, and the Senate's decree, the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, was not a direct order. It was a recommendation, an authorization for the consul to take whatever action he deemed necessary to protect the Republic. The final, agonizing decision was his and his alone. He was now standing in the chasm between law and necessity, and he had to choose. He knew the law. He, more than any man in that room, understood the profound sanctity of provocatio, the right of a citizen to appeal to the people. He had built his entire career on the principle of the supremacy of the law. To ignore it now would be to betray the very ideals he had championed his whole life. He would be saving the Republic by violating one of its most fundamental tenets. But he also knew the reality of the threat. Catiline's army was a clear and present danger. The captured conspirators were high-ranking, desperate men who, if left alive, could become martyrs or escape to lead a new wave of terror. The city was a powder keg, and any sign of hesitation from its leader could be the spark that ignited it. For weeks, he had lived with the constant threat of assassination. He had seen the abyss that lay just beneath the fragile surface of Roman order. In the end, pragmatism and his duty to protect the state from imminent collapse won out over his legal scruples. He decided to act, and to act immediately. Fearing that any delay might allow for a rescue attempt, Cicero did not wait for the next day. He decided the sentence must be carried out that very night, under the cover of darkness. He personally went to the houses where the 5 condemned men were being held under arrest. He took the leader, Lentulus Sura, by the hand and led him through the forum, escorted by a heavy guard. The other praetors brought the remaining 4 conspirators. They were led to the foot of the Capitoline Hill, to the most ancient and dreaded place in Rome, the Tullianum, the state prison. The Tullianum was not a place of long-term incarceration. It was a primitive, brutal holding pen and place of execution. It consisted of 2 chambers, one built on top of the other. The upper was a dark stone room. Below it was a deeper circular dungeon, accessible only through a hole in the ceiling. This lower chamber was a foul subterranean pit, a place of filth, darkness, and despair. One by one, the conspirators were lowered into this black hole. There, waiting in the gloom, were the official state executioners. The method of death was not the clean blow of an axe, but the grim and silent work of the strangler's cord. Cicero, as consul, would have stood in the upper chamber, waiting in the flickering torchlight. After a time, the executioners would have given the signal. Each of the 5 men, a former consul, a praetor, and 3 other Roman nobles, was dead. Cicero's Rubicon was crossed. He had taken the irrevocable step. He then walked back out into the forum, where a large, anxious crowd had gathered, waiting in the darkness for news. They did not know if the men had been imprisoned, exiled, or something more. As Cicero appeared, a hush fell over the square. He needed to announce what had been done, but to shout, "They are dead," would have been a crude and ill-omened proclamation. Instead, he chose a single, solemn, and brilliantly euphemistic Latin word. He looked out at the crowd and declared, "Vixerunt." The word literally means, "they have lived," implying that their lives were now over. The message was understood instantly. A massive roar of relief and gratitude erupted from the crowd. They surged around him, hailing him as their savior. Torches were lit, and a spontaneous procession formed to escort him home, the streets lined with citizens who cheered him from their doorways, calling him the second founder of Rome. A few days later, in the final act of this drama, Cato the Younger rose in the Senate. He who had provided the moral force for the executions now sought to give Cicero his ultimate reward. He officially proposed that Cicero be granted a title never before bestowed in this manner on a Roman statesman. He was to be called Pater Patri, the father of the fatherland. The motion was carried by a jubilant and grateful Senate. This was the absolute zenith of Cicero's life. He, the homo novus from Arpinum, the man the nobles had once scorned as an immigrant, was now officially the father of his country. He had achieved a level of glory and honor that surpassed his wildest dreams. He had saved the Republic. But as he stood at the peak, basking in the glow of adulation, a dark seed had been planted. The act that had made him the father of the fatherland, the execution of Roman citizens without trial, was a violation of the law. And in the years to come, his enemies would nurture that seed, waiting for the right moment to make it grow into the poisonous tree that would bring about his ruin. Cicero, the father of his fatherland, now stood at what he believed was the dawn of a new, stronger republic, one whose foundations he had personally secured. He had faced down a revolution and won. But in the years immediately following his consulship, the political ground in Rome began to shift beneath his feet in a way he failed to fully appreciate until it was too late. His very success had made him a target. Furthermore, his undeniable vanity began to work against him. In speech after speech, in letters and in poems, he constantly reminded Rome of his singular achievement. This relentless self-promotion, born of his lifelong insecurity, began to grate on the nerves of his allies and gave his enemies a weapon to portray him as an arrogant tyrant in the making. While Cicero was busy polishing his own legend, three men, each far more powerful and ruthless than Catiline had ever been, were beginning to see that the true obstacle to their ambitions was not a single conspiracy, but the traditional republican system itself, the very system Cicero had just saved. The first of these titans was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great. He was the most celebrated military hero of his age, returning to Rome in 62 BC after a spectacular series of campaigns in the east where he had defeated pirates, conquered kingdoms, and reorganized the entire Roman frontier, amassing a personal fortune that dwarfed the state treasury. He was so popular that many feared he would march his devoted legions on Rome, just as Sulla had done. Instead, he disbanded his army upon arriving in Italy, a gesture of respect for the law that Cicero praised. But this gesture made him politically vulnerable. He came to the Senate with two simple requests: that his numerous settlements and treaties in the East be ratified, and that his veterans be granted the land they had been promised. But a hard-line conservative faction in the Senate, led by Cato and a nobleman named Lucullus, distrusted Pompey's immense power and popularity. Seeing him as a potential king, they set about humiliating him, quibbling over every detail of his treaties and blocking any land bill for his veterans. Pompey, the conqueror of the East, found himself politically impotent and furious. The second titan was Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome. His wealth was legendary, built on real estate speculation and silver mines. Where Pompey had military glory, Crassus had the power of money, which he used to create a vast network of political and financial dependence. He had a long-standing and bitter rivalry with Pompey, and he burned with a desire for a major military command of his own that would allow him to match Pompey's prestige. He, too, came to the Senate with a request on behalf of the equestrian tax-collecting companies in which he had heavily invested, and he too was blocked by Cato's unyielding faction. He was another giant, stymied by the Senate's obstructionism. The third and most brilliant of the trio was Gaius Julius Caesar. He returned to Rome in 60 BC after a successful term as governor in Spain. He had two desires. The law granted him the right to a triumph, the glorious victory parade through Rome, for his military successes. But he also wanted to run for the consulship for the following year. A legal technicality, rigidly enforced by his enemies in the Senate, forbade him from doing both. He had to enter the city to declare his candidacy, but to do so would be to forfeit his right to a triumph, which could only be granted to a general waiting with his army outside the city walls. Forced to choose, Caesar gave up his triumph, a huge personal sacrifice, and entered the city to run for consul. He saw clearly what Pompey and Crassus were also learning: that working within the system was a fool's game when that system was controlled by a small, stubborn faction determined to block them at every turn. Caesar, the ultimate political strategist, saw an opportunity to do what no one thought possible. He approached his two great rivals, Pompey and Crassus, and made them a simple revolutionary proposal. He argued that as long as they remained divided, the Senate's small conservative clique would be able to play them off against each other and deny them their goals. But if they were to secretly pool their immense resources, Pompey's legions of loyal veterans, Crassus's bottomless reserves of cash, and Caesar's own soaring popularity and political genius, they could overcome any opposition. They could effectively seize control of the state and divide it amongst themselves. The deal was struck in secret. It was not a legal office. It was a private pact, a conspiracy of three that historians would later call the First Triumvirate. Its purpose was simple. Nothing would happen in the Roman state without the approval of all three men. This secret alliance was a death sentence for the free republic. It was the complete antithesis of everything Cicero stood for. He believed in open debate, the rule of law, and the authority of the Senate. The Triumvirate was a backroom deal that rendered all of those things irrelevant. When Caesar was duly elected consul for 59 BC, he brutally forced Pompey's and Crassus's demands through the assemblies, ignoring the Senate and even using mob violence to intimidate his opponents. Cicero watched in horror. The republic he had saved from Catiline was now being quietly suffocated by a far more powerful and insidious foe. He was offered a place in their alliance, a chance to be the respectable fourth man, but he refused. His integrity and his belief in the republic would not allow him to join what he correctly saw as a gang of three who aimed to be kings. This refusal made him an obstacle. He was too popular, too respected, and too independent to be allowed to operate freely. The three men who now secretly ruled Rome decided that the father of the fatherland needed to be taught a lesson. They needed a weapon to silence him, and they soon found the perfect one in the form of Cicero's most bitter personal enemy. The weapon the Triumvirate chose to unleash on Cicero was a man named Publius Clodius Pulcher. Like Catiline, Clodius was a patrician from an ancient and illustrious family, the Clodii. But he was a man who seemed to take a perverse delight in shredding every Roman tradition he was supposed to uphold. He was the ultimate aristocratic rebel, a brilliant, reckless, and utterly amoral demagogue who had chosen to become the gangster king of the Roman streets. He hated Cicero with a venomous personal passion, a hatred that stemmed from a bizarre and sacrilegious scandal that had rocked Rome a few years earlier and in which Cicero had played a key role. The feud began during the festival of the Bona Dea, the good goddess. This was one of the most sacred and mysterious religious rites in Rome, an all-female ceremony from which every single male was strictly forbidden. Even male animals had to be removed from the house where it was held. To intrude upon these rites was a terrifying act of sacrilege. In 62 BC, the festival was being hosted at the house of the Pontifex Maximus, Julius Caesar. During the ceremony, a figure dressed as a female lute player was discovered to be a man in disguise. That man was Clodius. His motive was scandalous. He was allegedly having an affair with Caesar's wife Pompeia, and had used the disguise to arrange a secret tryst. The ensuing uproar was immense. It was a religious and social crisis. Clodius was put on trial for sacrilege, a charge that could have led to his exile or death. During the trial, Clodius's defense rested on a simple claim, an alibi. He swore under oath that on the night of the festival, he was not even in Rome, but was miles away in the countryside. It seemed like a solid defense, and many were inclined to let the matter drop to avoid further scandal. But one man was called to the witness stand whose testimony would shatter Clodius's alibi. That man was Cicero. Cicero testified, also under oath, that he had seen and spoken with Clodius in Rome on the very day of the festival. His testimony was legally devastating. It proved that Clodius had committed perjury, that his entire defense was a lie. Cicero's motives for testifying are still debated. He claimed it was his solemn duty to tell the truth. It is also likely he was pressured to do so by his sternly moralistic wife Terentia, who disliked Clodius and his powerful, scheming sister Clodia. In the end, Clodius, through a massive campaign of bribery and intimidation of the jury, managed to secure an acquittal. But he never forgot the man who had publicly called him a liar and tried to destroy him. From that day forward, his life's mission was the complete and utter ruin of Marcus Tullius Cicero. With the secret backing of the Triumvirate, Clodius now had his chance. His first move was a brilliant piece of political theater. Despite being a patrician, he arranged to be legally adopted into a plebeian family. This maneuver, which Caesar as Pontifex Maximus conveniently approved, made him eligible to run for the powerful office of tribune of the plebs. As a tribune, he would be the so-called champion of the people, and more importantly, he would have the power to propose laws directly to the popular assemblies. He won the election, and in 58 BC, he made his move. He proposed a new law. The law was cleverly worded, a masterpiece of legalistic revenge. It did not mention Cicero by name. Instead, it stated, in general terms, that any Roman magistrate who had put Roman citizens to death without a formal trial and a verdict from the people would be condemned to exile. There was no doubt in anyone's mind who the target was. The law was aimed directly at Cicero's actions during the Catilinarian Conspiracy. Cicero was stunned. He had acted on the authority of the Senate, and he had been hailed as the father of the fatherland for what he had done. Now that very act was being turned into a crime. He frantically sought help from the men in power. He appealed to Pompey, the man whose career he had championed and whom he considered a friend. Pompey, bound by his pact with Caesar and unwilling to confront Clodius's popular mobs, gave him vague, evasive answers and then literally shut the door in his face. Caesar, in a move that was both cynical and seemingly generous, offered Cicero a way out. He invited Cicero to join his staff as he prepared to leave for his governorship in Gaul. This position would have given Cicero legal immunity and an honorable exit from a dangerous situation. But Cicero's pride and his deep attachment to Rome would not allow him to accept what he saw as a golden cage. He refused. He found himself utterly isolated. The Senate, which he had saved, was now terrified of Clodius's organized street gangs and paralyzed by the power of the triumvirs. The great nobles, many of whom had secretly resented Cicero's success, now watched with a cold satisfaction as he was brought low. The father of the fatherland had no allies left. Clodius's mobs filled the streets, openly threatening Cicero and his family with violence. Realizing that to stay and fight would be to risk being lynched in the Forum and plunging the city into a new round of bloodshed, Cicero made the most painful decision of his life. Before the law could even be formally passed, he chose to flee. In a state of profound shock and despair, he abandoned Rome, the city he loved and had saved, and went into voluntary exile. The trap had been sprung. Clodius's personal revenge was complete, and the Triumvirate had successfully silenced the most powerful independent voice in the Republic. Cicero's flight from Rome was not a strategic retreat. It was a complete psychological collapse. The man who had faced down assassins and defied a revolutionary army was utterly broken by the loss of his home and his status. For a Roman, exile was a form of civic death. It stripped a man of his property, his citizenship, and his very identity. For Cicero, whose entire sense of self was interwoven with his public role in Rome, It was a fate worse than death itself. The letters he wrote during this period, particularly to his dear friend Atticus, are some of the most raw and painful documents to survive from the ancient world. They are a window into the soul of a great man in the depths of despair. He was consumed by grief, regret, and a profound self-pity. The confident, sometimes arrogant voice of the consul was gone, replaced by the whimpering of a man who felt he had lost everything. "I have been foolish, I have been weak," he wrote to Atticus. "My grief is overpowering me. I call upon you to come to me, for I can no longer bear to live." He was plagued by suicidal thoughts, writing that he had been a coward for not taking his own life rather than enduring this humiliation. He wandered through the cities of Greece, Thessalonica, Dyrrhachium, places that had once been sources of inspiration and learning for him. Now they were just waypoints in his misery. He refused to see friends who came to comfort him, shutting himself away in a state of deep depression. He endlessly replayed his choices, torturing himself with the thought that he should have stayed and fought, or that he should have accepted Caesar's offer to go to Gaul. The father of the fatherland was now a man without a country, a ghost haunting the shores of the Adriatic, convinced his life was over. Back in Rome, Clodius moved to twist the knife. With Cicero gone, he passed a second, far more personal law. This one named Cicero directly, officially banishing him and forbidding him from coming within 400 miles of Italy. Anyone who sheltered him would face the same penalty. The law also decreed the confiscation of all his property. His beloved villas, his extensive library, his entire fortune, all were seized. But Clodius saved his most symbolic and cruel act for Cicero's magnificent house on the Palatine Hill, the very symbol of his success. He had the house torn down to its foundations. He then had his own men plunder the valuable marble and furnishings. To ensure it could never be rebuilt, he performed a religious ceremony, consecrating the now empty plot of land and dedicating a shrine there to the goddess Liberta's, liberty. It was an act of supreme and cynical hypocrisy. The man who had destroyed the liberty of Rome's most famous statesman was now posing as its champion. For a time, Clodius was the undisputed king of Rome. His power seemed absolute, but like so many bullies, his arrogance was his undoing. Unchecked by any real opposition, his armed gangs became a law unto themselves, terrorizing the entire city. And he made a critical mistake. He turned on his own sponsors. His mobs began to harass Pompey the Great, at one point besieging him in his own house for weeks. Pompey, the military hero who had once commanded the fear and respect of the world, was now a virtual prisoner in his own city, humiliated by the very thug he had allowed to rise to power. The Triumvirate's attack dog had slipped his leash. The political calculus in Rome began to shift dramatically. The elite, who had watched Cicero's fall with quiet satisfaction, now realized that Clodius was a threat to them all. The chaos was becoming intolerable. Slowly, a pro-Cicero backlash began to build. While Cicero languished in despair, others fought for him. His formidable wife, Terentia, worked tirelessly in Rome to protect what was left of their family's finances and to rally political support. His friend Atticus used his immense wealth and influence behind the scenes, and a new powerful force emerged on the streets. A tribune named Titus Annius Milo, a man just as ruthless as Clodius, decided to fight fire with fire. He raised his own private army of gladiators and thugs and began to engage in open street warfare with Clodius's gangs. The Forum, once the arena of Cicero's words, was now the scene of daily riots and bloody brawls. Pompey, finally roused from his political paralysis by the humiliation he had suffered, realized his mistake. He needed Cicero back. He needed Cicero's authority and eloquence to restore some semblance of order and to act as a counterweight to the out-of-control Clodius. With Pompey's immense influence now thrown behind the cause, the movement to recall Cicero from exile gained unstoppable momentum. The Senate, now free from Clodius's immediate intimidation, began to pass resolutions in Cicero's favor. After 16 long agonizing months of darkness, a ray of hope finally pierced through Cicero's despair. His civic death was not to be permanent. A path back to Rome was beginning to open. The Senate's decree recalling Cicero from exile was the signal that unleashed a tidal wave of popular support. His journey home from Greece to Italy was not the quiet, solitary trip of a pardoned man. It was one of the most remarkable triumphal processions a private citizen has ever received. The news of his coming traveled ahead of him, and as he made his way up the Italian peninsula, the entire country seemed to erupt in celebration. City after city emptied its population onto the roads to welcome him. Official delegations of local magistrates greeted him at their gates. Crowds of ordinary people, farmers, merchants, artisans, lined his route for miles, cheering, throwing flowers and weeping with joy. They hailed him not just as a returning statesman, but as a hero, a martyr for the cause of the Republic who had been unjustly cast out and was now gloriously restored. For Cicero, after 16 months of abject misery and despair, this outpouring of genuine affection and respect was a powerful, healing balm. It was a reaffirmation of everything he believed himself to be, the beloved father of his fatherland. But even this incredible display was a mere prelude to the scene that awaited him in Rome. His entry into the city was an event of epic proportions, deliberately staged to be as magnificent as possible. He was met at the city gates by a vast delegation of senators and a crowd of such immense size that it filled the streets. As he passed through the Forum, the very place where Clodius had once held sway, the roar of the crowd was deafening. The steps of the temples and the rooftops of the basilicas were packed with cheering citizens. He wrote later, with his characteristic lack of modesty, that it seemed as if Rome itself had risen from its foundations to welcome him back. In that moment, he felt he was more than a consul. He was a king in all but name, carried back to his home on a wave of popular adulation. The Senate, reflecting this mood, acted swiftly. They voted to rebuild his house on the Palatine Hill at public expense and to compensate him for the loss of his other properties. On the surface, it was a total victory. He had been cast down, and now he was exalted. Justice had triumphed. But this glorious, sun-drenched spectacle of popular acclaim was a beautiful, deceptive illusion. It was a magnificent facade that concealed a grim and rotten political reality. Cicero had not returned to the same republic he had left. The free state he had fought for, the state where policy was decided by open debate in the Senate, was gone. In its place was a hollow shell, a puppet theater whose strings were secretly pulled by the three men of the Triumvirate. And Cicero knew, with a sickening certainty in the pit of his stomach, that he had not returned as an independent leader. He had returned on their terms. He owed his restoration not to the principles of justice, but to the cold political calculation of Pompey, who now needed him as a weapon against Clodius. He was no longer a player in the game. He was a piece on the board, moved at the will of others. The humiliation came swiftly. The price of his return was his political soul. The great independent voice of the Republic was now expected to be a loyal mouthpiece for the triumvirs. He was forced to swallow his pride and put his legendary eloquence in the service of the very men who had stood by and watched as he was driven into exile. He found himself in the degrading position of having to deliver speeches in the Senate supporting measures he privately detested. In the courts, he was now compelled to defend men who were his former enemies and allies of the triumvirs. Men like Aulus Gabinius and Vatinius, whom he personally despised as corrupt scoundrels. Each of these speeches was a small death, a public act of submission that chipped away at his dignitas, his independent standing. He had his house back, he had his status back, but he had lost his freedom. He was a gilded captive, a living symbol of a restored republic that was, in fact, a sham. He could no longer speak his mind freely for fear of offending his powerful patrons. He was, as he lamented in a letter to a friend, politically castrated. The tragedy of his return was that he had come back to a city that looked like Rome, that sounded like Rome, but whose heart, the competitive, chaotic, but ultimately free spirit of the Republic, had been cut out. He had come home, only to find that his true home no longer existed. He was an exile once more, but this time it was an internal exile, trapped in a city of ghosts. The years that followed Cicero's return from exile were a period of deep political frustration, a gilded cage where his voice, once the most powerful in Rome, was now largely decorative. He was forced into a humiliating political submission, his days spent defending men he loathed and praising policies that turned his stomach. Increasingly, he sought refuge from the cynical theater of public life in the one realm where he was still truly free, the world of writing and ideas. He began to compose his great treatises on rhetoric, like De Orator, trying to codify and preserve the art that he could no longer practice with genuine independence. While he wrote, the unstable alliance of the three men who ruled Rome was beginning to fracture. The Triumvirate, a pact built on mutual convenience rather than trust, could not last. In 53 BC, the first pillar crumbled. Crassus, desperate for the military glory that had always eluded him, led a disastrous invasion of the Parthian Empire. He was defeated, killed, and his army was annihilated at the Battle of Carrhae. With Crassus gone, the fragile balance was broken. The two remaining giants, Pompey and Caesar, were left alone, circling each other like rival predators, and the Roman world was not big enough for both of them. As the political tension between the two men escalated, Cicero was forced back into a role he dreaded. As a former consul, he was required to take up a provincial governorship. He was assigned to govern Cilicia, a rugged, remote province in modern-day Turkey. He hated the appointment, seeing it as a form of prestigious banishment that took him away from Rome, the only place he felt he truly lived. Yet he performed his duty with the same scrupulous integrity he had shown in Sicily decades before. At a time when governors were expected to bleed their provinces dry, Cicero was a model of justice and restraint. He refused bribes, cut extravagant official expenses, and protected the local population from the predatory Roman tax collectors and moneylenders. He even managed a minor but successful military campaign against some mountain tribes, earning him the title of Imperator from his troops. He performed his duty flawlessly, all the while writing desperate letters home, counting the days until he could return to the center of the world. When he finally returned to Italy in late 50 BC, he found the Republic on the absolute brink of the abyss. The standoff between Pompey and Caesar had reached its breaking point. The Senate, now largely allied with Pompey and led by hardliners like Cato, ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. Caesar knew that to do so would be to place himself at the mercy of his enemies, who would surely prosecute and destroy him. In January of 49 BC, he made his fateful decision. He led one of his legions across the Rubicon River, the small stream that marked the boundary of his province, an act of open rebellion and a declaration of war on the state. Cicero was plunged into the most agonizing choice of his life. This was not a clear battle between good and evil, as the fight against Catiline had been. For him, it was a choice between two potential tyrants. He had a personal, if strained, relationship with Pompey, and Pompey was, at least nominally, the champion of the Senate and the constitutional government. But Cicero was not blind. He knew Pompey was a vainglorious and politically inept leader, and he was horrified by the bloodthirsty talk of proscriptions and revenge coming from Pompey's camp. On the other hand, he feared Caesar's ambition and his revolutionary energy, but he also recognized Caesar's brilliance and his surprising capacity for clemency. For weeks he agonized, his letters revealing a mind tormented by indecision. In the end, his deep-seated loyalty to the idea of the Republic, his duty as a senator, proved decisive. With a heavy heart and a profound sense of foreboding, He chose what he saw as the lesser of two evils. He sailed across the Adriatic to join the camp of Pompey and the Senate. The war was swift and decisive. Caesar's military genius was unstoppable. At the Battle of Pharsalus, Pompey's much larger army was crushed. Pompey himself fled to Egypt, where he was ignominiously murdered. The Republican cause was lost forever. Cicero, who had been too ill and disheartened to even take part in the battle, now had to face the victor. He returned to Italy, expecting the worst. But Caesar, a master of politics as well as war, chose a policy of calculated mercy. He greeted Cicero with respect and granted him a full pardon. Cicero was free to return to his life and his villas, but his public career was over. The Republic was dead. All power now resided in one man, Caesar, the dictator. For Cicero, this was intolerable. He could not openly oppose Caesar, but he could not serve a tyrant. He was forced into a final, silent retirement, an odium, a life of leisure dedicated to study. It was in this moment of profound political despair that fate dealt him a final, devastating blow, an emotional wound from which he would never truly recover. In February of 45 BC, his beloved daughter Tullia died shortly after giving birth. Cicero was utterly shattered. Tullia had been the light of his life, his confidant, the one person whose affection was pure and unconditional. Her death plunged him into a black abyss of grief that was far deeper and darker than anything he had experienced in exile. He fled to one of his more remote villas, shut himself away from the world, and for months did nothing but read and write, trying to find some philosophical answer, some consolation for his unbearable pain. And it was here, in the depths of his personal and political despair, that he embarked on one of the most astonishing intellectual projects in history. He decided to give Rome a philosophy. Up to this point, philosophy was something one read in Greek, a language only the educated elite could master. Latin, the language of law and soldiers, lacked the vocabulary for complex, abstract thought. So Cicero invented it. In a furious burst of creative energy over the next 2 years, he wrote a whole library of philosophical works. He created the Latin words for concepts we still use today, derived from his work. Words like quality, individual, moral, and definition. In works like the Tusculan Disputations, he explored the nature of grief and the fear of death, turning his own therapy into a gift for posterity. In De Officiis on Judies, written as a letter to his son, he tried to define what it means to be a good person in a corrupt state. With the Real Republic lost, he built a new, immortal one in his books. The politician had been silenced, but the thinker had found his true, enduring voice. Cicero was building an immortal republic in his books, a quiet life of philosophical contemplation, when suddenly, on the 15th of March, 44 BC, the Ides of March, a violent political earthquake shook Rome to its foundations. On that day, a group of senators, calling themselves the Liberatores, the Liberators, cornered Julius Caesar at a meeting of the Senate and stabbed him to death. The conspirators, led by Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, were not a fringe group. They were senators and praetors, men who believed they were acting not as murderers, but as patriotic tyrannicides, striking down a king to restore the liberty of the Republic. They had deliberately excluded Cicero from their plot. They knew he was a man of law, not of the dagger, and perhaps they feared his famous indecisiveness would cause him to hesitate. But the moment the deed was done, Cicero's support for them was total and passionate. He rejoiced, seeing Caesar's death not as a crime, but as a glorious necessary act that had surgically removed a cancer from the body politic. For a brief, hopeful moment, he believed the dream was alive again, that the free republic could be reborn from Caesar's blood. This optimism proved to be tragically naive. The liberators had a plan to kill the tyrant, but they had no plan for what to do the day after. They had imagined that with Caesar gone, the republic would magically spring back to life, that the Senate would gratefully resume its rightful place as the head of the state. They were fatally wrong. They had killed the man, but they had not killed the source of his power, the loyalty of his army, the love of the common people, and the raw ambition of the men he had left behind. They hesitated, failing to seize control of the state, and in that moment of hesitation, a power vacuum opened. And into that vacuum stepped a man who was far more dangerous and far less predictable than Caesar had ever been: Mark Antony. Marcus Antonius was Caesar's most loyal lieutenant, his co-consul for that year, and a man who combined a soldier's charisma with a politician's cunning and an insatiable appetite for power, pleasure, and revenge. While Brutus and Cassius were giving idealistic speeches to a confused and frightened Senate, Antony, a master of political theater, made his move. He secured possession of Caesar's will and his vast private treasury. Then, at Caesar's public funeral in the Forum, he delivered one of the most masterful and manipulative speeches in history. He began by speaking calmly, pretending to uphold the Senate's amnesty for the assassins. But then he unveiled Caesar's bloody toga, holding it up for the crowd to see, pointing out the rips and rents left by the daggers. He read from Caesar's will, revealing that the dictator had left a considerable sum of money to every single citizen of Rome. He whipped the crowd into a frenzy of grief and rage, transforming Caesar from a dead tyrant into a beloved martyred father of the people. The mob, screaming for vengeance, took firebrands from the funeral pyre and surged through the city, hunting for the assassins, who were forced to flee for their lives. With that single speech, Antony had seized control of Rome. He was now the de facto heir to Caesar's power. Cicero watched all of this from the sidelines with a growing sense of horror. He saw in Antony everything he despised. Where Caesar had been a majestic lion, a dangerous but often merciful and brilliant creature, Antony seemed to him a common wolf, a man driven by base appetites, a drunkard, a debaucher, and a brute who used military intimidation to get his way. He saw Antony distributing public offices to his cronies, plundering the state treasury, and cynically using Caesar's forged papers to justify his every move. He saw another, even more vulgar tyranny rising from the ashes of the last. And at the age of 62, with his health failing and his political career seemingly over, Cicero felt a final great duty stir within him. He had nothing left to lose. His daughter was dead. The republic he loved was on the verge of its final extinction. The old warrior of the word decided he would make one last stand. In the autumn of 44 BC, he returned to the Senate and launched his final, and arguably greatest, oratorical campaign. He began to deliver a series of blistering, ferocious speeches against Mark Antony. There would be 14 in total, and they would become known to history as the Philippics, in honor of the speeches that the great Greek orator Demosthenes had delivered centuries before against the tyrant King Philip of Macedon. The Philippics are the culmination of Cicero's entire life's work. They are an explosion of rhetorical genius, a white-hot fusion of legal argument, savage personal insult, and passionate appeals to republican liberty. In these speeches, Cicero holds nothing back. He paints Antony as a public enemy, a bankrupt, a coward who avoided the battlefield, a glutton, and a man who had offered a crown to Caesar, an act of supreme treason against the Republic. He ridiculed his public drunkenness and his scandalous personal life. But the Philippics were far more than just character assassination. They were a powerful call to arms. Cicero was attempting to rally the divided and frightened Senate, to stiffen their spine, and convince them to do what the liberators had failed to do: to formally declare Antony an enemy of the state and to raise an army to destroy him. For a few brief, brilliant months it seemed to be working. Electrified by Cicero's eloquence and moral force, the Senate rediscovered its courage. Cicero, the old statesman who had been relegated to writing books, was suddenly the undisputed leader of Rome, directing its political and military strategy from the Senate floor. He was fighting the final battle of his life, wielding the only weapon he had ever truly mastered. His voice, against a man who only understood the language of the sword. With every brilliant speech, with every sharpened insult, he was not only fighting for the Republic, he was signing his own death warrant. Cicero's bold strategy to rally the Senate against Antony required more than just words. It required an army. And in the chaotic aftermath of Caesar's death, a new and unexpected military power had emerged. This was the army of Caesar's official heir, his great-nephew, a sickly but preternaturally shrewd and ambitious 19-year-old named Gaius Octavius, who now called himself Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. He had raised a private army from his adoptive father's loyal veterans, positioning himself as the true avenger of Caesar. Cicero, in a daring and ultimately fatal political gamble, decided to use this young man as the Senate's sword. He saw Octavian as a tool, not as a major player. He publicly praised the young man in the Senate, showering him with honors and titles, famously quipping that the boy should be praised, honored, and done away with. His plan was cynical but clear. He would use Octavian's name and his legions to crush Antony. And then, once Antony was eliminated, he believed he could easily sideline or control the politically inexperienced teenager and restore the full authority of the Senate. It was the single greatest miscalculation of his life. He saw a pawn, but he was looking at the future master of the Roman world. At first, the plan seemed to work brilliantly. The armies of the Senate, led by the two serving consuls and accompanied by the young Octavian, engaged Antony's forces in northern Italy and defeated him. But the victory came at a catastrophic cost. Both consuls were killed in the fighting, leaving Octavian in sole command of the entire victorious senatorial army. And it was at this moment that the young man showed his true, ruthless ambition. The Senate, believing the war was won, slighted Octavian and tried to dismiss him. In response, he did what every Roman strongman now did when confronted by the Senate. He marched his army on Rome. He entered the city without resistance and, through pure military intimidation, forced the terrified Senate to name him consul at the age of just 20. The weapon Cicero had tried to wield had turned and seized its master. What followed was the final, inevitable betrayal. Having secured his power in Rome, Octavian did the one thing Cicero believed he never would. He flew north to meet with his supposed archenemy, Mark Antony. There, along with another of Caesar's former generals named Lepidus, the three men formed a new, official, and far more terrifying alliance, the Second Triumvirate. This was not a secret pact like the first one. It was a formal 5-year military dictatorship, legally ratified by the cowed Roman state. Their stated goals were to hunt down Caesar's assassins and to restore order to the Republic. Their true goal was to carve up the Roman world amongst themselves and to eliminate every single one of their political and personal enemies. And to achieve this, they revived the most horrific tool of Roman political terror, the proscriptions. Once again, as in the time of Sulla, official death lists were posted in the Forum. But this time, the slaughter was more systematic, more widespread, and driven by a cold-blooded need for cash to pay their vast armies. Hundreds of senators and thousands of wealthy equestrians were declared enemies of the state. Their properties were confiscated, and a price was put on their heads, unleashing a new wave of terror and bounty hunting across Italy. When the three triumvirs were negotiating the names to be placed on this list, Antony had one absolute, non-negotiable condition for his participation in the alliance. At the very top of his list, as the first and most important victim, he demanded the name of Marcus Tullius Cicero. For Antony, this was not politics. It was personal. The man who had savaged him in the Philippics had to die. Octavian, the young man whom Cicero had nurtured, praised, and promoted as the savior of the state, reportedly hesitated for a day. But his loyalty was to power, not to the man who had helped him achieve it. He consented. The father of the Fatherland was officially condemned to death by the very boy he had raised to prominence. The news reached Cicero at one of his villas near the coast. His first instinct was to flee, to try to reach the camp of Brutus and Cassius in the east. His loyal slaves carried him in a litter towards the sea, but the winter weather made sailing impossible. A profound weariness and a fatalistic sense of resignation seemed to settle over him. He ordered his men to turn back, reportedly saying, "Let me die in the fatherland I have so often saved." Soon, Antony's soldiers, led by a centurion, arrived. They found Cicero being carried through the woods. His slaves, loyal to the very end, wanted to fight and defend him, but Cicero forbade them. According to the historian Livy, he calmly ordered them to set the litter down. He then leaned his head out, his chin resting in his hand, a characteristic pose of a philosopher in thought. He looked his executioners directly in the eye and, with his final words, criticized their technique, telling the centurion to strike true. The soldier, with a single blow of his sword, cut off his head. Then, on Antony's specific and brutal orders, he also severed the hands, the very hands that had written the Philippics. His head and hands were taken back to Rome and, in a final act of gruesome vengeance, were nailed to the rostra in the Forum. It was the same speaker's platform from which he had so often defended the Republic with his voice. The message was a brutal and terrifying symbol for all of Rome to see. The voice of free speech had been silenced, its instruments mutilated and displayed as a warning. With the death of Cicero, the last true voice of the Roman Republic was extinguished. Politically, his life ended in total failure. The state he loved was gone forever, replaced by the imperial autocracy he had fought his entire life to prevent. But the true story of Cicero does not end with his butchered remains on the rostra. His ultimate victory, his final revenge, was his survival through his writings. While the names of many of his powerful enemies faded into historical footnotes, his speeches, his letters, and his philosophical works were painstakingly copied and preserved through the centuries. During the Renaissance, the rediscovery of his letters helped to spark the intellectual revolution of humanism. The political thinkers of the Enlightenment and the founding fathers of the United States read his works on law, duty, and the nature of the state, and they saw in him the ultimate champion of a balanced constitutional republic. For 2,000 years, his prose style became the universal model for clear, powerful, and elegant expression in the West. He was a complex man, vain, often indecisive, and a flawed political strategist. But he was, until the very end, a man who passionately believed that reason, law, and eloquence were more powerful than brute force. His life is the eternal and tragic story of a single individual's struggle against the relentless tides of history. And while the politician was defeated, the thinker, the writer, and the enduring symbol of freedom of speech achieved the one thing his enemies never could: immortality.